Magic Awakened. Rise of the Arcanist. More Than Magic. Book 6. Elizabeth Kirke. Narrated by Amanda Day.
And Nicholas Cain. This audiobook is a Mercs with Mics production.
Chapter 1. Mariana. Honestly, Mystic Key seems exactly like the Caribbean islands I visited with my family a couple of years ago. It was surrounded by peaceful, clear waters that I was itching to dive into. And the palm tree dotted beach we were standing on was the sort of place I could imagine sunbathing for hours. Even the somewhat gaudy resort screamed tropical paradise. With its pink cement walls and over-the-top nautical theme, there was just one problem with it all,
Okay, let me get this straight.
Thomas said, looking pained.
Fletcher told you that if you wanted to become a blood witch, you need to find the mystic key.
Jen swallowed hard and nodded.
Then the Minotaur,
Thomas continued, obviously still coming to terms with the fact we all just fought a real, live Minotaur.
decided to let us live if we promised to kill this Mistress Olaria, who was either a powerful blood witch or an actual arcanist.
Jen nodded again.
And the labyrinth dumped us here,
Thomas gestured around in annoyance.
on a place called Mystic Cay, which is...
He turned and looked at me. Pronounced key, not K, I said. According to my tour guide, anyway. Everyone, including me, turned to Danny for confirmation.
Don't look at me,
He said.
I'm a water elemental, not a linguistic elemental. I've never even been to the Caribbean. I have no idea how to pronounce it.
He crossed his arms over his chest and added,
For the record, this is why I hate English.
Danny added something in Greek, and T.S., the only other one of us who spoke it, chuckled. Jen shrugged. It can't be a coincidence. Fletcher told me to find the Mystic Key, and now we're supposed to kill a blood witch on an island called Mystic Key. T.S. cursed.
No, I don't think it's a coincidence. Right, we should... Tom?
Thomas had suddenly snapped his head toward the water and was looking out over it with a frown.
I think I heard a ship. Danielle?
Danny looked the same direction, and his eyes swirled with darker shades of blue as he focused on the water.
There's something disrupting the current. A little too far to... Wait.
He waded out into the water and stood still, eyes narrowed.
Yes, there is a ship. It's small, though.
He shook his head.
Can't tell any more than that at this distance. Want me to check it out? No.
T.S. said quickly.
Not until we figure out more about the island. No sense in taking an unnecessary risk for what could just be a ship passing by.
We stayed put for a while, hoping the doorway to the labyrinth would reopen, while trying to come up with a way to explore the resort without alerting the bloodcasters to our presence. It soon became clear that the ship was not just passing by. It sailed into view with several blasts from its horn, heading straight for the island. We carefully made our way back toward the dock and watched as the ship approached. It wasn't a very large ship, clearly not designed to travel very far. I could only see a couple of decks, one made of large windows and an open one above it, both lined with people. As it drew closer, we could see it said Mystic Key Ferry on the side, along with a painted cartoon ferry.
I guess tropical bloodcasters prefer tacky to creepy?
Said Danny. Using the dunes as cover, we crept as close as we dared, keeping an eye out for anyone nearby. It took some time, and I was starting to long to get out of the sun and into the water, but at last, people started disembarking. Some looked like they were ready for a day at the beach with towels and totes, while others had fairly large suitcases, and some nothing at all. The line slowly moved as people got off the ferry. It seemed like they were stopping somewhere. Then slowly they began to break off, most heading for the resort, some ambling down to the beach.
They smell like non-magics.
Thomas said as a breeze blew in our favor.
Charlie, is anyone the wrong temperature for non-magics?
Danny asked.
No?
Charlie answered slowly, eyes flickering as he watched them with thermal vision.
Doesn't look like it. What would a bunch of bloodcasters be doing running a resort full of non-magics?
Thomas asked. Maybe they aren't running it, Jen suggested, although she didn't look very convinced. Honestly, we aren't even sure Alaria's here. The only thing we have to go on is Mystic Key. Maybe. She pulled out her phone and frowned at it, then held it high, obviously trying to get a signal. T.S. took out his own and glared at it.
Of course.
He snorted in annoyance.
Why would we be lucky enough to have service? Anyone?
We all checked and shook our heads.
Mine won't even turn on.
Thomas said.
Probably ruined it in that stupid ocean.
Bugger. Right then. We need to get closer.
T.S. turned and studied us.
Tom, you're in. We'll need your eyes and nose down there. I'd go, but I'm bloody useless while the sun is up. If anything happens, well, it's best we're split up anyway, so we know.
Thomas nodded grimly.
Plus, you look human.
T.S. continued.
If there are bloodcasters or other kinds of magics down there, you won't draw attention to yourself. With any luck, you'd smell them before they get too close anyway.
I suppose that means we're both out,
Danny said, tilting his head toward Charlie.
Afraid so.
To my surprise, T.S. turned to me.
I want you with Tom.
Me? He nodded.
I don't want Tom down there alone. But with Jen's connection to the rack, if something happens to her... Besides, with our phones not working, we need another way to get word to John. If all else fails, we'll have to send Daniel. Then rack will be the only way they know we're okay, and where to find us. That means the last place we want Jen right now is in the middle of things. If you do think you're in danger, just get to the water and get clear.
I nodded. Okay,
She may be human,
Danny said.
but her hair is going to be a dead giveaway if someone sees her.
I pulled a handful of it from over my shoulder and frowned at the obvious streaks of green mixed in with blonde. A non-magic couldn't even see it, but a magic would know immediately I was a mermaid. If only I had something to cover it with. Actually, I have an idea, I said. Since we need to blend in with the tourists anyway, I certainly wasn't going to need my sweatshirt here, so I untied it from my waist, then grabbed my knife and cut off a sleeve.
Question.
Danny said. You'll see. I tugged the larger side over my hair like a massive ponytail holder and started trying to adjust it.
Clever,
Danny said, coming over to help. He fiddled with it for a moment, humming softly in pants.
Oh, don't let him near your hair.
Charlie groaned. After watching briefly, he came over and shouldered Danny out of the way.
Move, before you cause permanent damage. Hey,
Danny chuckled, stepping willingly aside. I couldn't see what Charlie was doing, but a minute later, he backed away in satisfaction.
I'm actually impressed.
Thomas said. I wouldn't know it was a sweatshirt if I hadn't seen it, said Jen.
Why are you so good at that?
Danny demanded.
I have a twin sister.
Replied Charlie.
And a daughter. I have the same daughter. And she won't let you near her hair.
Danny shrugged agreeably.
Yeah, that's fair.
As nice as it is to see something Danny isn't obnoxiously good at,
Began T.S.
Hey,
you two need to get down there and mingle with the crowd, before they get too far from the ferry.
Thomas nodded to me, and the two of us headed down the beach toward the dock.
stick close.
He said.
If I say run, get to the water and swim like hell.
I hummed agreeably, but slipped a hand into my pocket and clenched it around my knife. The soft sand turned into sand-covered boards as we headed up a ramp onto the dock over the shallows. We hadn't gone far when I heard a quiet whistle, followed by a splash. We both turned toward the water. There was nobody there, but two pairs of sunglasses were sitting on the edge of the dock. Perfect, I said, kneeling down to grab them.
Where did he get those?
Thomas demanded as I handed him a pair. People lose their sunglasses near the docks all the time, I told him. There are probably 100 down there. I inspected mine and was pleased to see Danny had cleaned them quite thoroughly. Be glad he didn't get you a girly pair. Thomas chuckled and put them on.
Oh, that's actually much better. Even if they are just to help us blend in.
As we walked along the dock, we watched the people gathered alongside the ferry. The line of people disembarking turned into more of a cluster as people filled up the dock. Thomas and I wordlessly stopped just on the outside of it. Nobody seemed to notice or care. In just a few minutes, we were folded into the milling crowd. I stepped on something and looked down to see a damp towel. As I moved away from it, I noticed that Mystic Key was embroidered along the edge. Several people around me were holding identical towels, so I surreptitiously picked it up and draped it over my arm, making sure the logo was easily visible. Thomas noticed and shot me a small smile and a nod. The crowd gradually moved down the dock, and we went with it. If Thomas heard or smelled anything, he kept it to himself. I craned my neck over the people and could see several podiums set up. Each one had someone in a colorful polo greeting guests. It wasn't long before we were at the front of the dwindling crowd. A woman at a podium waved us over, and with a nervous glance at each other, Thomas and I joined her. "Welcome to Mystic Key," she said happily. "The Caribbean's best-kept secret. Is this your first visit?"
Yes.
Thomas said, forcing a smile at her. "Wonderful. Welcome, welcome. Did you get a chance to go over how everything works while you were on board?"
We,
Thomas began. I added an embarrassed giggle for show, and the woman smiled at us. "Not to worry. I know it's a bit hectic and exciting," she said. "Let me go over it all quickly with you. Mystic Key is all-inclusive." We both nodded, and she continued. "The ferry arrives at 11 and leaves promptly at 6. You'll be back in Miami by 10. Miami. I swallowed hard. Miami was where our list of suspected bloodcasters kept visiting. It was either a coincidence or we were smack in the middle of something huge and probably dangerous. "Dinner is served on board just like breakfast was," she continued. "You're here for lunch. We have 2 restaurants and a buffet, included, of course. Some of our guided activities are included as well. When you boarded, they gave you cards and told you to keep them,"
yes.
Thomas said carefully. I reflexively reached for my purse and sighed in relief as she waved a hand. "No need to show me. Just don't throw them out. If you choose any activities or rentals that aren't covered, they'll need to mark your cards. When you return to Miami, they'll check them over and you'll pay for the length of your stay and any additional fees before disembarking. Let's see, you can also choose to stay overnight in our luxury hotel. Your cards are dated, so you'll be charged accordingly per night and based on 3 meals a day, although our buffet is always open for the duration of your visit." "How long can we stay?" I asked. "As long as you want." She grabbed a booklet from a pile on her podium. "Here's a map of the resort. Please stay in the designated areas for safety. It also includes a list of activities with meeting times and places. We have snorkeling, kayaking, nature hikes, and restaurant hours. Basically, everything you need to know." With a wide smile, she handed me the guide. "If you do want to stay the night, just head up to the hotel and they'll help you out in the lobby. Any other questions?"
No, well, how long have you worked here?
Thomas asked. "This is going to be my 3rd summer." "Do you like it?" I asked. "Oh, it's the best. The pay isn't great," she whispered, then shrugged. "But I don't pay a cent while I'm here. No rent, no food costs. They provide the uniform, and I get paid to live on a tropical island. And everyone is so friendly,"
How do you get a job like this?
asked Thomas. The girl shrugged. "I saw it advertised on the internet,"
Cool. Thanks.
Thomas said. "Enjoy your visit," she called as we started walking up an oyster shell pathway to the gaudy pink castle. "What was she?" I asked as we walked.
Non-magic.
Thomas glanced behind us with a frown.
They all are. I haven't smelled a single magic since we got here.
"So the bloodcasters are running a non-magic resort?"
That's what it seems.
He trailed off and yawned.
Excuse me.
I smiled sympathetically. God, he must have been exhausted. I was too, and so were the others. It had easily been an entire day since I'd slept. No exaggeration. Escaping the vines and other things in the labyrinth had been tiring enough, not to mention walking for miles upon miles, where Charlie was still suffering from blood magic too. Throw in just the emotional strain, and I was honestly surprised I wasn't ready to collapse, although I did have a headache. Maybe we should get a room, I suggested. We could all use a place to sleep.
As long as they don't ask for that card, that's not a bad idea. If this is just a non-magic resort, then being able to snag some free food and a place to rest is going to be very useful.
Something occurred to me, and I stopped in my tracks. It's all inclusive, I gasped. We get food and a room and can stay as long as we want without paying anything until we leave,
Yes?
Thomas said, eyeing me curiously.
I sort of just said that.
What if we want to stay for 6 months?
Why would...
His eyes widened in shock.
Holy shit.
He breathed. 6 months. The amount of time the bloodcasters on our list went without spending anything. Each one took a leave of absence from work. Most had transactions showing they went to Miami, and then they seemed to vanish for 6 months before another transaction showed up. If they were coming here, they'd have food and board and literally could vanish.
But
He said, his eyes narrowing.
we didn't see any huge charges after they get back to Miami.
Maybe they aren't being charged, I suggested. What if this is a non-magic resort, but the bloodcasters are behind it somehow? Go to Miami, sneak onto the ferry, and then just stay here for 6 months doing that initiation or whatever Fletcher talked about. It would be impossible to trace them,
I hate how well that fits.
Thomas said. Drought, no, I said. Then why the labyrinth? What's the point of being able to come and go through that if they're going to Miami and getting on the ferry?
Every time I think we're closer, we get more questions.
Thomas snarled. We fell silent as we reached the gate to the castle-like hotel. I bit back a laugh at the cheesy, trident-wielding mermaid statues flanking it. Both tales were ridiculous. Whoever made the statues obviously had never seen a real mermaid. The lines up to the front desk moved quickly. To my relief, it looked like they weren't asking for the cards or any sort of ID at all. As we waited, I flipped through my little booklet. There are private cabanas, I said, pointing to a spot on the map. Thomas looked at them curiously.
They're pretty far from the main resort.
He said.
And look, this here says there's an employee area nearby.
Before I could reply, it was our turn,
Welcome!
said the guy at the desk as we walked up. Hi, I said. We just got here and wanted a room?
Sure thing.
He grabbed a key off a pegboard behind him and held it up.
Just drop this in the basket when you leave.
He nodded to a basket on the counter. Thomas started to reach for it, then hesitated.
Can we get a cabana? Are those included? Cabanas are extra.
The man said.
I'm afraid you have to reserve them in advance, though. They're all booked. How far ahead do you have to reserve them?
Thomas asked.
Months,
The guy said.
I'm so sorry. But I assure you, our rooms here are just as nice and almost as private. Plus, they're closer to the food and the beach.
He held out the key again. Thomas took it with a smile.
Thanks. Hey, I don't have any service. Could I make a phone call? Oh,
The guy smiled awkwardly.
sorry. Someone should have told you. We're off the grid here. No phones. No internet either.
Thomas and I exchanged a look of alarm. What if there's an emergency? I blurted.
Not to worry. We have medical staff on hand and a clinic equipped to handle just about anything that could happen here. In the event of a more serious emergency, we can radio for medical transport.
I could tell from the way he rattled it off that it was a practice speech.
Okay.
Thomas said.
Thanks, then.
We were directed to our room and we headed off.
Great. That leaves Danny swimming for help. Unless we can track down this radio.
Thomas muttered. I agreed, and we turned out of the lobby and down a hall lined with doors to the guest rooms. As we walked, Thomas seemed to be going quite slowly, taking his time near each door. What are you doing? I asked.
Checking for magics. So far, nothing.
He took a step back and looked at the door.
Most have been slept in. Everything seems so normal. Except
Except there's a labyrinth doorway on the beach, and the Minotaur wanted us to come here to kill a blood witch, I said, ticking the points off my fingers. And it's called Mystic Key, and the ferry departs from Miami.
yeah,
Thomas said grimly.
except that.
We found our room and poked our heads in. Thomas sniffed and hunted around, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Armed with our map, we started heading back to the others. As we walked down the hall, we passed a woman in an employee polo. We all nodded and smiled to each other, but as soon as we rounded the corner, Thomas picked up his pace and turned the wrong way. What? I began, hesitating when I realized he was trying to follow a scent.
That woman.
He said between sniffs.
She's a witch. I think I caught a whiff of blood magic, too. Faint, but
I swallowed nervously and looked behind us. Do you think she noticed us?
I don't think so. Let's hope not.
We followed her trail to a locked door labeled Employees Only.
So, one witch.
Thomas said. Who works here? I added.
I smell the buffet.
He chuckled.
We should see if we can grab anything. Jen and TS are probably starving. Well, I know TS is.
We were almost to the buffet when Thomas stopped in his tracks and whipped his head around.
Something's wrong.
He gasped. What?
Come on.
We hurried through the hallways and out onto the beach as fast as we could without attracting attention. Just when I thought it was safe to start running, Thomas slowed down a bit. What is it? I asked.
It's not an emergency. Still urgent, but no need to be reckless.
Nevertheless, we hurried along the beach, trying to avoid the crowd. There were people spread out on towels and splashing in the water now. We kept going around the dunes and back to where the labyrinth entrance was. There, much farther down the beach, I spotted the others. Everything looked fine to me. Jen and Charlie were standing on the beach, and Danny and TS were in the water. As I watched, Danny bent over abruptly. It looked like he was throwing up. I glanced behind us. We were out of sight from the tourists. That was all I needed to know. I sprinted down the beach. Instead of stopping me, Thomas took off as well, easily outpacing me. I caught up after he was already standing with Danny and TS. Charlie was right at the edge of the water, eyes flaring wildly. Jen was between him and the others, clearly ready to stop him from impulsively getting wet. She looked worried too. TS, in all honesty, looked a lot better now that he wasn't able to sense Delilah dying, but he certainly wasn't happy. Danny? I cried as I splashed up. He turned toward me with a weak grin.
Hey, Kath.
He said hoarsely. His eyes were churning with gray, and his normally tan skin was pale.
Hold that thought.
He said quickly before I could say anything. Danny spun away from me and then started retching. Didn't seem like anything was coming up. He was just dry heaving. But it sounded awful, and he was obviously in some sort of pain. I started to panic. Had his stomach injury somehow returned?
I really fucking
He growled between gags.
hate blood magic.
Chapter 2. Jen. Danny hadn't been gone for more than a few minutes when he staggered back up into the shallow water and threw up an alarming amount of black liquid.
I'm okay.
He choked when Charlie cried out in alarm. Danny threw up more of it before dropping to his knees and gasping.
There's blood magic in the water.
I held Charlie back, nearly burning my hands, while TS rushed to help Danny.
If there's blood magic in the water, then get out!
Charlie yelled at him as Danny sat down right next to where he was. leaving T.S. to kneel next to him.
Not in this water,
Danny said. I don't think that clarified things, and based on his expression, Charlie didn't either. Danny adjusted his position and put his head down between his knees like he was trying not to pass out. After a minute or so, T.S. helped him to his feet. He was barely standing again before he threw up more black water. To my relief, Thomas came flying down the beach, with Mariana not far behind.
What happened?
He demanded, coming to a stop in a spray of water and wet sand.
I don't know.
T.S. said.
He said there's blood magic in the water.
What?
Cried Thomas. Danny, Mariana called, rushing up to join them. He said something to her, then doubled over and started vomiting again, although this time nothing came up.
I really fucking hate blood magic,
Danny said as he coughed. He sat heavily in the water, then flopped backward with nothing but one knee sticking out. There was some aspects of being a magic I was still getting used to. One of them was seeing water elements just go underwater without coming up. I knew he could breathe, but I still felt uneasy as I watched the surf gently lapping over his face as he lay there, without coming up for air. Blood magic? Mariana asked in alarm. T.S. shrugged helplessly. Danny sat up with a groan and pointed down the beach, where he had gone earlier.
We got sick of waiting while you guys were up at the resort. So I figured I'd take a quick lap around the island.
He shook his head and sighed heavily.
I didn't get far. There was a barrier that said, no guests beyond this point. So, of course, I went beyond that point.
He sighed again and ran a hand through his hair.
The water started tasting foul pretty quickly. But it took me a little while to realize it was, I don't know, tainted, I guess? With blood magic.
He stood, with a little help from Thomas, and shook his head.
If I hadn't turned back when I did, well, based on the fact that they have all the deeper water roped off, I don't think anyone is getting off this island by water. We're not going anywhere unless we figure out how to sneak onto that ferry.
With that, Danny splashed out of the water. I let go of Charlie's shirt and he hurried to Danny's side, even though his shoes got wet.
If you could stop scaring the hell out of me, thinking you're about to die, again, that would be great,
Charlie said, throwing his arms around Danny.
Believe me, I'd like nothing more,
Danny said.
What happened at the resort?
T.S. asked, as he and Thomas joined us on the beach. Thomas and Mariana told us all about the resort, the complete lack of magics, and the room, as well as their suspicions about Miami.
Well, this place just keeps getting better and better,
said Danny.
Can't complain about getting some food, though.
T.S. said.
If there really are that few magics about, let's see if we can get into the room unseen, and then eat. I'm knackered. We could all use a good sleep. Daniel, you up to finding a couple more pairs of sunglasses? Anything we can do to make you and Charlie stick out a bit less?
Danny nodded.
Yeah, this water's fine. Be careful,
Charlie called. Danny waved, then jogged a little and dove in. We all sighed in relief when he was back just a few minutes later with enough sunglasses for all of us.
Figured we might as well all hit the resort in style.
He chuckled.
Also,
He held up 2 sopping wet things, then dried them and tossed one to Charlie.
since your hair is more than a little conspicuous.
Charlie considered the bucket hat skeptically, then pulled it on.
Whoever lost this probably threw it in the water on purpose.
Danny chuckled, and with a smirk, put on a Detroit Lions cap.
Bloody hell. How long did you spend looking for that?
T.S. asked.
Sheer luck.
Danny said.
It even fits. I might keep this. You should throw that in the water on purpose.
Thomas suggested.
Excuse you.
I've been a fan since before you were born.
Danny haughtily adjusted the hat.
That's your fault.
Said Thomas, starting off down the beach. We walked after them as they argued about Danny's favorite football team. It was weirdly normal. Just the six of us, walking together while Danny and Thomas teased each other. I felt nervous as we got onto the beach with other people, but it didn't seem like anyone took even a second to look at us. Thankfully, Thomas had already been there, so he took the lead, carefully sniffing to make sure there were no magics lurking around. We hurried down the hallways of the pink castle, and Mariana quickly unlocked our room, and we released a collective sigh as the door shut.
I don't think there were any magics out there.
Thomas said. He turned to Mariana.
Let's grab food like we were planning earlier. We'll be back.
After a nerve-wracking few minutes, they were back with plenty of food for all of us. Danny said he was full from his time in the ocean, but Thomas obviously needed to feed, and Charlie was worn out from the blood magic attack. We could see a bunch of driftwood from our balcony, so Thomas ran down to grab some for Charlie. Once he was settled in and enjoying some wood, the rest of us ate voraciously. When we were done, Danny checked the water in the bathroom, just in case, and we started taking turns enjoying much-needed showers. While I was gratefully washing and shampooing, Thomas poked his head into the bathroom.
Danny suggests we wash our clothes and he'll dry them. Want me to do yours?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Do you need soap? I asked.
Nah, there's some in the sink. Let me know if the water temperature changes while I'm washing them. Unless you want to say water.
Thomas added with a weak chuckle. Sure, I said, grateful for anything somewhat normal. It'll be easier to wash them in here anyway. The resort certainly didn't skimp on luxury, and there was plenty of room for two in the shower. I stepped out of the way and sat on a little teak stool in the corner and helped him with our clothes. When we were done, we tossed them out into the sink, and I waited while Thomas washed himself. It was normal, and yet not normal at all. Just a few months since moving to New York, and I was already taking things like this for granted. How quickly, how easily I had almost lost it. One wrong move in that labyrinth, and I would have never seen Thomas again. The last time we shared a shower would have been the last, and I hadn't even known it. My eyes drifted to his chest, searching for some sign he had been impaled by the Minotaur only a couple of hours ago. I wondered just how much in the labyrinth was real and how much was an illusion, but decided that the confusion was probably the point. Unfortunately, even with that behind us, we were far from safe. We might get a few hours or a day to rest here in the resort, but then we had to find Alaria. If she really was who Fletcher called his mistress, then how powerful was she? This, right now, could be our last day together. Ever. A small sob escaped my lips at the thought. Thomas wiped the water from his face and looked at me curiously.
Jen?
I shrugged and suddenly couldn't speak. He knelt down and his green eyes met mine. I reached up and brushed some of his hair, much darker brown since it was wet, off his forehead. For a moment, we just looked at each other wordlessly. Then, so fast I hardly saw, his hand shot forward as he grabbed me by the back of my neck. He tugged me closer and kissed me hard. I put both my hands on his chest and kissed him back. He pulled away, just a little, and pressed his forehead against mine with a sigh as the water from the shower splashed down over us. It reminded me of our very first kiss. It had been raining, and we were in mortal danger then, too. That was back when I didn't know if he liked me. In fact, I had been trying to convince myself I didn't have a crush on him. But when things looked bleak, and we were positive we were about to die, he had kissed me before pleading with me to run. I grabbed him, then kissed him again, wrapping my arms around his shoulders. I wasn't strong enough to stop him if he really wanted to pull away. But he knew I didn't want him to. I wouldn't run this time. One way or another, we were going to fight these bloodcasters together. Thomas adjusted his grip on me and then stood, easily lifting me up. In spite of the danger lurking outside of the hotel room, I laughed as he did. He shot me a challenging grin, and I wrapped my legs around his waist as we kissed. "You need to feed," I murmured as I ran my hands over his back, trying to find the best place to hold him.
I will,
He whispered, gently nipping my lower lip. "More than a pint."
I'll drink what I need.
"Thomas," I growled. He lifted me higher, then mock dropped me a few inches, and I let out a little shriek of surprise.
You're hardly in a position to bargain.
He teased, shifting me to one hand and pressing a finger to my lips. He glanced to the side and rolled his eyes. "What did Danny say?" I guessed.
Something stupid.
Thomas chuckled. He used his free hand to brush some of my hair behind one ear, then grabbed me by the thigh and adjusted how he was supporting me again.
Although, I might follow his advice anyway. Was that your purse I saw in here?
"Yeah?"
You didn't happen to bring any,
"Now? Here?" He flushed.
I mean, we kind of almost died, and
"You're so awkward," I laughed. But yes, I did. They're in that little zippered pocket. He set me down just long enough to dip out of the shower and was back in a flash, swallowing a little pill-sized potion. He handed one to me and I popped it in my mouth as he lifted me back up, this time pressing me against the wall, leaving both hands free. He waited until I had swallowed the potion, then kissed me. I wrapped my arms and legs around him and kissed him back. I was far too distracted by other things we were doing to notice when he switched from kissing to numbing my neck, but it was impossible to miss the way his entire body shuddered against mine as he started feeding. His shoulders stiffened beneath my hands, and he half moaned, half whimpered into my neck. He was hungrier than he had let on. To his credit, he did take longer to feed than usual. When he was just about done feeding, he moved to press me between him and the wall to get a better position. This time, we both moaned. A couple of minutes later, after gently making sure the fang punctures had started healing, he eased me to my feet. We stood there for a little longer with our arms around each other. I rested my head against his chest and just tried to enjoy the moment.
some of us would like a turn.
Danny yelled, banging on the door.
Asshole.
Thomas muttered into my hair with a chuckle. He kissed me on the top of my head, then reluctantly stepped back.
We should probably.
"Yeah," I said, not wanting this moment to end. We both quickly washed up again, then stepped out to dry off.
You're going to dry our clothes, right?
Thomas asked, sticking his head out the door. I didn't expect Danny to join us in the bathroom and tighten my towel in surprise as he did. He dried my clothes, then thrust them at me. I noticed some unusually dark waves in his eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked, nervously hurrying out of the bathroom.
Yep.
Danny gave Thomas his clothes, then turned him around and started literally shoving him out of the bathroom.
Goodbye. Hey, wait. Didn't you shower before we did?
Thomas demanded.
I said we wanted a turn, not a shower.
Danny replied.
Sorry.
Charlie said, not sounding terribly sorry as he slipped between us and into the bathroom. He practically slammed the door, eyes flaring with dark red. "Elementals," Mariana said with a long-suffering sigh. Thomas knocked on the door.
Do you need a contraceptive potion?
He called.
You're going to regret interrupting.
Danny yelled back.
After 30 seconds? You're probably not even undressed.
Thomas said, knocking again for good measure.
Go away.
Chuckling, Thomas got dressed and, Sort of shielding myself from the others with a towel, I did the same.
Do you need more blood?
T.S. asked.
I'm okay.
T.S. tilted his head and studied Thomas for a moment, but nodded in satisfaction.
Right.
He stretched and slid out of a chair to sprawl out on the floor with a throw pillow.
I'm going to take a nap then.
Once I would have asked if he was going to be comfortable, but it seemed werewolves were usually content to sleep anywhere, even as humans. The bed was huge, so Thomas and I easily fit on one side, with Mariana on the other and room to spare. I snuggled up under one of his arms, reluctant to sleep in case things weren't as safe as they seemed.
Get some rest.
Thomas told me. What about you?
I'll sleep later.
He said.
I'm feeling pretty good from that blood.
I leaned up to kiss him before settling back. I reached out my senses for Rack. He was still a mess of emotions. Relief, confusion, concern, and now that he could tell I was resting and safe, somewhat content. Thomas groaned and covered his ears.
He was right. I regret it.
I laughed and closed my eyes. It was after sunset when I woke up again. I must have really slept deeply. Danny and Charlie had joined us without waking me and were on the other side of the bed, both still sleeping. I was relieved to see that the veins in Charlie's arm were already faded from black to gray. At some point, T.S. had shifted, and a huge wolf was curled up on the foot of the bed. I was hungry again, and it wasn't long before the others started waking up. We decided that we all felt better, but still a bit tired, so Mariana and Thomas risked another trip to the buffet, and we ate a big meal before all settling back down to go to sleep again. It reminded me of the cruise when we first met. Hiding here was eerily similar to hiding from a dangerous vampire in our room on the ship. Being able to see the ocean if I looked out the window added to the bittersweet ambiance. That trip nearly ended in disaster, but against all odds, we survived. As I drifted off to sleep again, I hoped we'd make it out of this one, too. Chapter 3, Jen. In all honesty, I was surprised when I woke up in the morning without incident. I assumed that something would have happened in the night, maybe an attack or at least a scare that woke us. Instead, it was mid-morning, and I felt shockingly well-rested. The sun was streaming in through the open curtains, and I had a perfect view of the ocean. I always wanted to visit the Caribbean, but a trip like this wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Mariana and Thomas set out for the buffet again, while I went out to gather a bit more driftwood for Charlie, careful to stay within sight of the stairway that led up to our room. A horn blast caught my attention, and I looked out over the water and saw the ferry. I hurried back to the room, just in time to meet Thomas and Mariana, who had seen the ferry as well. We ate in a tense silence, all watching the ferry as it drew near. Our room had a perfect view of the dock, so we could easily see when they started to disembark.
All non-magics again, do you think?
T.S. asked.
Looks like it so far.
Thomas said.
Can't smell them from here, though.
Wait! Mariana gasped. She leaned against the railing of our balcony, shading her eyes and frowning out at the ferry. Thought I saw a jackal, or at least a black dog? I swallowed nervously. Unless the jackal was unbonded, then it was there with a witch or a wizard.
Where?
Danny asked. Down there, next to the piling with the life preserver on it. There! Mariana cried.
I see it.
Charlie said, pointing.
Looks like a jackal to me,
said Thomas. I nodded in agreement as the black canine stood patiently on the dock.
Who's it with?
T.S. asked.
I can't tell.
Thomas shook his head.
I'll go down to the lobby and see if I can find anything out.
I'll come with.
Danny said instantly.
No. As long as the jackal doesn't catch my scent, I'll be fine. One look, and they'll know what you are.
Wait until the jackal is near the lobby at least.
T.S. said.
There's no reason to mill around, risking being caught if we don't have to.
Thomas nodded in agreement. We all quietly watched the people disembarking, keeping an eye out for any other magics. Soon, the jackal and a young-looking man with a suitcase were heading up the pathway toward the hotel. Thomas went out to the lobby, and we were left waiting nervously. I was glad T.S. could sense him through their bond. He looked slightly concerned, but as long as he was calm, I knew Thomas was okay. Nevertheless, I heaved a sigh of relief when T.S. announced Thomas was on the way back.
Wizard.
Thomas said, as he rejoined us on the balcony.
One wizard and a jackal. I didn't see or smell any other magics. I couldn't tell if he was a blood wizard either.
Did the jackal notice you?
Danny asked. Thomas shook his head.
I stayed pretty far away and kept an eye on him. If he did smell me, he didn't react at all.
Something interesting happened, though.
T.S. said confidently, tilting his head curiously at Thomas.
Guess where the wizard is staying,
said Thomas. The cabanas? Mariana suggested right away.
Bingo.
Danny cleared his throat.
Didn't you say those have to be reserved months in advance?
Thomas nodded.
Bit of a stretch to say it's a coincidence the only magic guest we've seen is staying there,
T.S. said.
Where are those?
Charlie asked. We went back into the room and pulled out the guidebook Mariana had been given. She opened it up to the map page and pointed out the cabanas.
Maybe it's just me,
Danny said.
but if I reserved a private cabana on a tropical island well in advance of my trip, I'd be pretty pissed to find out the hotel has an ocean view, while the cabanas are in the middle of the jungle. That's a fair point.
T.S. said.
They aren't in the most ideal location, are they?
If the map is right, they're all just clustered together there, too. Not very private.
Charlie added.
Unless you want privacy from, say, non-magics?
Thomas suggested.
I think we should go check it out.
T.S. said.
Tonight?
Asked Thomas.
Sounds good to me.
Danny said. But after spending most of the day sitting in the room, we all started to get antsy long before sunset. We watched people lining up to get back on the ferry, keeping an eye out for the departing magics, but saw none.
That's the second ferry to leave since we got here.
Danny said.
What if Ilaria was on one? No way to be sure until we check out the cabanas.
T.S. said. He sighed and glared up at the sky impatiently.
Couple more hours until sunset.
I'm sick of waiting, too.
Thomas said in agreement.
Then let's go.
Danny said.
Charlie and I aren't exactly constrained by the sunset.
He picked up the map and studied it.
Considering we'll be sneaking around, it'll practically be sunset by the time we get there anyway.
T.S. looked hesitant, but stood and started pacing.
I don't like it. But I don't like that we spent all day sitting about either. If we did miss Ilaria, I don't know what we'll do.
Honestly,
Charlie said slowly.
now might be the best time to go.
We all turned to look at him, and he shrugged.
Just thinking about my parents' dude ranch. Nobody's in the cabins during the day. That's when all the action is. I know there's supposed to be some beach party tonight, but I'd be surprised if Bloodcasters are going to that. Danny got me thinking. When he said we aren't constrained by the sunset, neither are the Bloodcasters, as far as we know. We're sitting here assuming they're all in the cabanas right now, but they could be out.
He nodded toward Thomas.
You think you saw a blood witch in an employee uniform. They could all be out doing stuff right now. This might be the best time to find the cabanas empty. We could head over there after sunset and be outnumbered.
His eyes flared.
Not that we fared well against just one.
T.S. groaned.
I hate to agree, but that's a possibility. The fact is, until we've actually seen the cabanas, we have no idea what to do.
He stretched.
Right. Let's go. Cautiously. If we get all the way to the cabanas without incident, we'll go from there.
We got out of the hotel without running into any magics. and headed down a path that led into the woods. It soon split into 3 different directions: ocean trail, forest trail, and employees only.
So, which one leads to the cabanas?
Danny asked. Thomas nodded toward the employees only path.
The jackal and the wizard went down that way.
Which means either the cabanas are so private that they don't even want people who aren't staying there to find them, or our suspicions are correct. These cabanas aren't what they seem.
Said T.S.
Everyone, be ready.
I drew my wand warily as we walked. It was extremely weird to feel so uneasy in broad daylight. The sunlight came easily through the trees, and I saw glimpses of the ocean between the trunks. The weather was perfect, almost a little too hot even for an island hike. Sometimes I could swear I could hear the ocean. A couple of colorful birds flew by, followed shortly by a refreshing breeze. Yet we were following the scent of a possible blood wizard.
I don't know if they'd risk a trap with so many non-magics around.
T.S. said softly.
But remember, if you hear that blood magic crackle, you run.
Everyone murmured softly in agreement.
Stop.
Thomas said suddenly, before slowly beckoning us closer. The trees parted into a clearing, revealing a dozen small cabins. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but based on the cheesy pink castle, it certainly wasn't a bunch of nondescript buildings. They were all small and simple, with no nautical themes to speak of. Certainly nothing I would have wanted to reserve in advance. That was for sure. I also couldn't see anything that indicated these were associated with the resort.
These are the cabanas?
Danny whispered, obviously as unimpressed as I was.
The wizard and jackal were here,
Said Thomas.
I can still smell them, but they aren't around now.
He tilted his head slightly and frowned.
I don't think anyone is here now. But I can smell more people. Witches and wizards. No non-magics, though.
Can you tell us where they went?
T.S. asked.
Without going too close. We don't want any of the familiars to smell us.
Thomas's eyes narrowed.
Now that you mention it, I don't smell any.
Any what?
Familiars. I can't smell any, aside from the jackal we saw.
But you smell witches and wizards? I asked. I thought we all had familiars,
Most do.
said Thomas.
You don't have to bond, though, if you don't want to. But it's weird they're all together here. I can smell, probably a dozen different people. One familiar. Maybe bloodcasters don't bond.
Charlie said.
Well, Fletcher
T.S. trailed off.
had a familiar.
Danny finished grimly.
Until he went to Miami. And then, presumably, here.
We all looked at each other in horror. Do you think they're killing familiars? I gasped in horror. As much as I missed Rack, my throat closed up at the thought of these bloodcasters trying to hurt him. My knees felt weak. Thank God he was safe in New York,
I don't know if I'd put it past them at this point.
said Thomas. For a few moments, we all sat there silently, mulling it all over.
We need to keep going.
T.S. said. Almost as one, we nodded to him, and Thomas cautiously led the way around the cabanas and to the other path. This one, just dirt instead of shells.
Are you all right?
T.S. asked suddenly. Thomas stopped and turned back to us, frowning.
I don't know. I feel kind of... My hand!
Charlie said. I turned to look and gasped in alarm. The veins in his arm and hand, where Donna had struck him with the blood magic, had faded to gray, but now they were turning black again right before my eyes.
I have a small problem.
Danny said suddenly. Oh, God, Mariana cried. I was almost afraid to look, but I forced my gaze away from the almost mesmerizing way Charlie's veins were darkening to look at Danny. Honestly, I wish I hadn't. One hand was pressed up under his nose, as dark blue blood dripped through his fingers. Even worse was the fact that he looked worried.
I could probably use some water.
He said too casually.
Water!
T.S. gasped.
That's it? They didn't just use blood magic to make a barrier around the island. It's protecting whatever they're hiding here, too.
We have to get back to the public area.
Thomas said.
It's happening to you, too.
T.S. cried. He was right. Thomas's veins were slowly darkening and swelling too. We started to run, sprinting back through the woods, heedless of whether or not we attracted attention. The public area seemed much farther away than I thought, even though we were moving so much faster than before. My legs were throbbing, and my lungs were burning as we burst into the area where the paths split.
Is that it?
Thomas turned back, breathing hard, eyes scanning the trees behind us. The ink-black veins had spread up his neck and across his cheeks.
Is crossing back all we have to do?
Did we cross? Mariana asked. How do we even know what's safe?
If they're trying to keep people away from whatever they're doing,
T.S. said.
it makes sense they'd set traps in the employee areas. Just like with the water.
Speaking of water,
Danny gasped. He sat down heavily, one hand still under his nose, the other pressed against the side of his head.
ashes.
Charlie spat.
Come on, get up.
He wiggled beneath one of Danny's arms and pulled him to his feet, clutching his injured arm against his chest. Here. Mariana tucked herself under Danny's other arm and started toward the ocean trail path.
Char, stop.
Danny said weakly.
Get yourself some wood. I'll be fine.
But
You're not getting in the water with me. Get some wood.
Charlie reluctantly stepped back. He turned to face us, and I realized in horror it wasn't just his arm. Your face, I gasped. It's still spreading. He raised a hand in alarm to his cheek, then lowered it to examine the darkening, swelling veins.
maybe I do need some wood.
After looking around for a moment, he crouched down next to a fallen log and put his hands on it. I watched nervously as he burned it, hoping it would help. Do you need blood? I asked Thomas. He shook his head.
I'm okay. Actually, I think I feel a little better.
I glanced at T.S. for confirmation and was relieved when he nodded. As soon as Charlie was done, he gingerly rose to his feet and started down the ocean trail. To my relief, it looked like the darkening of his veins had stopped spreading. In fact, they even looked a bit grayer. Thomas, T.S., and I quickly followed him to the ocean trail. It seemed like a long way down to the beach, and I was afraid Danny and Mariana hadn't made it to the water. Every time the path was obscured, as it curved around the thick underbrush, my heart started pounding as I expected to find them behind it. To my relief, the trees soon opened to the beach, and I spotted Mariana, with Danny lying next to her, down in the shallows, sitting in the water. Even better, there didn't seem to be any tourists around. We hurried down the beach to join them.
Is he all right?
Charlie cried, stopping at the edge of the water. Despite being underwater, Danny evidently heard him and raised out an arm to give a thumbs up. I think so, Mariana answered. She glanced down at Danny, then added, He says yes. Are you?
Yeah, I'm okay now.
Charlie said. Mariana looked back down into the water and whistled something in Panther. Charlie sat down in the sand with an audible sigh of relief. My knees felt weak, and I heaved my own sigh. As if blood magic wasn't scary enough when I thought it just came out in the form of a sudden attack. Now, I knew it could be slow and insidious. What if we hadn't been able to get back in time? How much worse would it have gotten? With a start, I realized that I hadn't been affected. I was so distracted worrying about the others that I hadn't even bothered worrying about myself. Frowning, I examined my arms and hands, looking for any sign of darkening veins.
Jen, are you all right?
asked Thomas in alarm when he saw what I was doing. Yeah, I held up my arms to show him. I'm completely fine. It didn't seem to affect me. Why was that? Was it because I was a witch? Or was it something more? I thought of how Fletcher told me I'd be a good blood witch and felt a chill. What if there was something more to it? Would I had some quality that kept the blood magic from hurting me? It didn't get me either, Mariana said. Thank God. That made me feel better. It wasn't just me. But why didn't it affect us? I asked.
Maybe it only works if you've been hit by blood magic before?
Charlie suggested.
Then why wasn't I affected?
T.S. asked. He raised an arm, and I could easily see his veins hadn't grown darker either.
I haven't struck by blood magic before, but I'm grand. Besides, if they want to keep people out, it doesn't make sense that they have to be affected by blood magic first. Not unless they're cursing everyone when they get on the ferry.
What else is there? I asked. Why just the three of us? We all stayed together, so it can't be a matter of how long we were exposed, Mariana asked, walking out of the water and up to us. Her green hair lightened and turned back to blonde, leaving just a few green streaks as she changed back into a human. Wait! I looked at the sun, then to T.S. We're human, I gasped. All three of us are human.
Bloody hell, that must be it,
T.S. said.
You know what that means.
T.S. cast a grim look out over the water towards the sun. T.S. heaved a sigh.
We have until sunset to figure out what the bloodcasters are hiding.
He looked at me and Mariana.
Otherwise it'll just be you two. Not that I'll be much help. I'm fucking useless as a human.
Mariana cleared her throat and looked pointedly at him, then gestured to herself.
Don't be so hard on yourself,
T.S. said.
You've made it through some pretty dangerous situations. Not to mention you've started taking some lessons. I know you'll manage.
If you think that now, imagine what I'll be able to do with a few more decades of practice and experience, Mariana said.
Exactly.
Mariana crossed her arms over her chest and fixed T.S. with a smug grin. Exactly. She couldn't mimic as a human, but she nailed his accent in my opinion. Thomas laughed while T.S. stammered for a moment.
Right.
T.S. said, clearing his throat.
You got me there.
He chuckled, then looked up at the sun with a grimace.
If we're doing this, it needs to be now.
Danny joined us, looking like he was feeling quite a bit better.
We should get back to the hotel and out of sight. It's one thing to hope they don't realize we're not human from a distance. But this...
He twisted one of his arms back and forth, showing the blackened veins running down it.
I don't know if it would have killed us if we spent too long sneaking around where they don't want us. But now, it's a dead giveaway we were there. He's right.
T.S. agreed.
You're all marked now. We can't risk you being seen. We'll go back to the hotel then, if we can.
Thomas said.
I'll let you know when we're safely back in the room. Be careful.
You be careful too, I said. With no time to waste, we headed back up to the path. It was more stressful knowing we no longer had vampire ears and a nose on our side, and the three of us were relieved when we reached the cabanas without incident. We started to circle around when T.S. hesitated. What is it? I whispered.
I'm wondering if we should check these out now. From here on out, I can't follow the jackal's scent. We could waste time going the wrong way. But these still look empty. And we don't know how long that will hold true.
In all honesty, I had felt uncomfortable delving any deeper into the woods without the others. I was the only one of us now who would stand any chance against a bloodcaster, and even then, I would be grossly outmatched. My best hope would be a few pathetic spells as a distraction while we tried to escape. If we ran into more than one bloodcaster, though, we were finished. Let's check it out, I said, hoping I sounded less nervous than I felt.
Wait, look for wards first.
T.S. whispered. Glad that I had learned briefly about that type of advanced magic, I scanned around us for anything with a strange symbol carved on it. I don't see any, I said.
Blood magic must be enough then.
T.S. said.
Let's go.
Cautiously, the three of us crept out into the clearing among the little shacks, and sure enough, nobody seemed to be around. This doesn't even look like a nice employee living space, Mariana said. The girl who checked us in made it seem like they have all these fun activities, but this is just downright depressing. I wouldn't want to stay here,
Something about it doesn't feel right.
T.S. said.
That's for sure.
We walked up to the closest cabin and tried the door. It was unlocked. I probably could have unlocked it with a spell, but I was glad I wouldn't have to, just in case it left some sort of trace. With a wary glance around us, T.S. went in, and Mariana and I followed. The inside was just as stark as the outside. There was nothing but an uncomfortable-looking bed, a cheap-looking dresser, and a small bookshelf. A composting toilet was tucked in an alcove behind a curtain, with a shower head jutting out of the wall nearby. There's no way guests are supposed to stay here, Mariana said. Nobody would reserve these when they can stay in a hotel room like ours. I'd hate to stay here even as an employee, I said.
Potions.
T.S. said suddenly. He crouched down by the bookshelf.
Wish I could smell where the damn.
He muttered.
These sure look like potions, though.
I knelt next to him to examine the contents of the shelf. It was full of glass jars of different sizes, all with different leaves and powders stuffed into them. I suppose they could have been for something else, but I wasn't sure what, and they certainly looked like the potions ingredients I had seen. Well, someone is staying here, Mariana said, sliding a drawer shut. It's full of clothes. What is? She slipped around us and crossed the small room to pull something down off the door. She held it up with a frown. It was a black, hooded cloak.
That's not typical island wear.
T.S. said grimly. People don't actually wear those, do they? I asked skeptically. After several years as a witch, I had yet to see anyone wearing anything I'd consider unusual. The only real exception was that Mariana and most other mermaids I met preferred to wear skirts, but even then, they wore normal-looking skirts.
Not for centuries.
T.S. said.
Of course, seeing as these bloodcasters seem to be part of some ancient cult, I wouldn't really be surprised if they still wear them.
He stood and looked around.
Let's go to another one.
We carefully looked out to make sure the clearing was still empty, then hurried out to the next cabin. This one was totally empty. No potions, no clothes, nothing.
They're safe in the hotel,
Announced T.S. with satisfaction. Good, I said in relief. I pushed myself to my feet after making sure there was nothing under the bed. Nothing there. Nothing in here either. Mariana tried to close a drawer, but it was stuck. She shoved it a little harder. It groaned and squeaked, then thudded closed. Is someone there? Called a woman's voice. The three of us spun in alarm. T.S. grabbed me by the shoulder and yanked me down so I couldn't be seen from the window. Hello? The voice called. We looked at each other, eyes wide in fear. If this was a blood witch. I heard you. Come out, the voice demanded. I'll go, I whispered, starting to stand. T.S. caught my wrist and shook his head. She'll find all of us if I don't. I'm a witch. I'm the only one who's supposed to be here, I hissed. Mariana rolled under the bed, and T.S. backed up behind the curtain, both watching me nervously. Flashed what I hoped was a confident smile, and opened the door. There, standing not far from the shack, was a woman in a black cloak. What are you doing here? She demanded, snapping out a wand at me. A witch. But was she a blood witch? What are you doing here? I echoed, unable to think of anything better. I yanked out my own wand and aimed it at her. Her demeanor changed almost instantly, and she lowered her wand with an almost embarrassed smile. I'm sorry, I thought you were a non-magic. Oh, I trailed off, unsure of what to say. I obviously couldn't say I thought the same thing, not when she had her wand out first. I was saved when her eyes widened with recognition. Oh, you must be Donna. For a moment, I just gaped at her. She knew that name. She must have been a blood witch. But was I so lucky that I had come across the one who didn't know what Donna looked like? Yes, I said, taking a deep breath. Yes, I am. And you are? Taylor. Her eyes narrowed. Mistress Ilaria thought you were arriving yesterday. She's not going to be very happy with you. Ilaria. I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression at the name, frantically thinking of how to respond. I was delayed, I said. I have, interesting information that will please her. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I winced inwardly. What a stupid thing to say. To my surprise, Taylor seemed to buy it. We should get to the ritual then. It's starting soon, and even interesting information won't save you from her wrath if you're late. I was changing, I bluffed, gesturing slightly to the door behind me. The ferry arrived hours ago, she said. What have... Oh, right. You get used to the labyrinth. I guess you just got here. Sorry, I'm not... She trailed off and nodded, more to herself than to me. As she did, I noticed she looked as if she'd been crying. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took a couple of steps closer to her. Are you okay? I asked nervously. Fine, she snapped, quickly wiping one eye with the sleeve of her cloak. I'm fine. I wondered what would make a blood witch cry. Do you want to talk about it? I offered, hoping that not all of them were as cruel as Fletcher was. She looked surprised, and I swallowed nervously, praying I hadn't messed up. It's just, she began. A new initiate arrived earlier on the ferry, and he had a jackal and... Taylor cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders. We're not supposed to talk about it. You know that. I had so many questions, none of which I could actually ask. Did she mean they weren't supposed to talk about familiars? Why would someone with a jackal make her cry? Then, there was the word initiate. Didn't Fletcher say he was initiated? Is that what was happening here? I know, I bluffed. That doesn't mean we don't. Talk about it, that is. Sometimes it helps to get it off your chest. Surely that was true even for bloodcasters. She actually smiled a little, even as I could swear I saw tears in her eyes. When were you initiated? I frantically thought of a number. Fletcher had taken his vacation 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago? Ah, she nodded, seemingly accepting it. My initiation was 5 months ago. I thought I was okay. Well, the jackal today was the first familiar I've seen, and Taylor paused and took a deep breath. I had a jackal too. I didn't expect to get so emotional. And knowing he's doing his initiation soon, she shrugged and forced another smile. I understand, I offered. Oh my God, they were killing their familiars. This was horrible. I thought it was just a test, Taylor blurted. You know, I thought it was just a test of my loyalty to Ilaria. I didn't think that it was really... She paused and wiped at her eyes again. Anyway, it's worth it, the power, right? Yeah, I said, trying to sound more confident. Totally worth it. And it gets easier? I nodded. Taylor sighed. I'm sorry. Please don't tell Mistress Ilaria. I won't, I said. With a start, I saw a way out. Why don't you go on ahead to the ritual? You could probably use a couple of minutes alone, and I don't want you to be late because of me. I need to prepare a couple of things for Mistress Ilaria. Okay. Thank you, Donna. You're welcome. With a nod and a swish of her cloak, Taylor started away, heading in the direction of the scent Thomas had been following. As soon as she was out of sight, I rushed back into the shack, where I was met by a pair of stunned faces. They are killing familiars, Mariana gasped.
If I heard that correctly,
T.S. said grimly.
Ilaria is here, right now.
Yeah, I said. Now that Taylor was gone, I could feel myself shaking. What do we do? Whispered Mariana.
I hate to say it,
Said T.S.
but I think we have to try and follow her. We still hardly know anything about blood magic. We don't know how many are here, and we don't even know what Ilaria looks like. This might be our only chance to get some information. Once the sun sets, I have to go back, and I won't leave you two here alone. But if we don't go now...
Mariana and I nodded nervously. The three of us hurried out of the shack and headed in the direction Taylor had gone, going toward Ilaria and some sort of bloodcaster ritual.
Chapter 4. T.S.
I wasn't sure what was harder, trying to conceal how anxious I was from Jen and Mariana, or trying to block Tom so he wouldn't sense it. The truth was, though, I was completely out of my element, and quite unsettled by it. It was frustrating as well. Being the first one to go into an unknown, potentially dangerous situation was literally in my job description. Yet I had never done it in broad daylight when I was stuck as a fecking human. If something happened, the best I'd be able to do was physically block a spell. 2, if I was lucky, and hope it was enough for Jen and Mariana to get somewhere safe. It didn't help matters that I couldn't hear or smell a bloody thing. All at once, I spotted something behind the trees and stopped in my tracks, flinging out my arms in front of my packmates. Even more cautiously now, we inched closer. Then all gasped as we got a better view. We had reached the far end of the island. The trees opened into a flat cliff, overlooking the ocean, and there, right in the middle, was a large stone altar, identical to the one in the cavern where we fought Fletcher. Unlike the cavern, the area was far from abandoned. I quickly counted 10 bloodcasters, shrouded in black cloaks. 8 of them were standing in a semicircle with their backs to us. The other 2 were standing opposite them, on the other side of the altar. Unlike the rest of them, they both had their hoods pulled back. My eyes locked onto one of the 2, and I couldn't look away. She had pale skin and was breathtakingly, impossibly gorgeous. No, that wasn't quite it. Something about her beauty bothered me. She was too beautiful. It wasn't right. Her long hair, as dark as her cloak, lashed around her in the wind. In spite of her unsettling attractiveness, she sent shivers up my spine. That has to be Ilaria, Jen whispered.
She's...
Jen cleared her throat awkwardly.
I mean, she's a siren.
Mariana gasped. That explained it. I took another look, trying to see beyond what I now knew was a siren's aura. Yes, she was certainly more frightening than beautiful.
She's scary.
Mariana said, frowning.
Sirens aren't supposed to freak you out, just...
She laughed nervously.
turn you on.
I nodded. Something about her,
I thought she was supposed to be a witch.
Jen said.
A blood witch. The Minotaur said she was something more, but I didn't think he meant... Wait.
Squinting, Mariana pushed aside a couple of leaves and adjusted her position.
That woman's not a water elemental.
Are you certain? I asked.
Yes.
Mariana sounded slightly indignant.
She may look like a siren, but she's not even a water elemental at all. That's not possible, is it?
Jen asked. Mariana and I shook our heads. I wish I could hear them better, I grumbled. If only the sun were set, my ears would certainly be keen enough to hear them easily. As if granting my wish, the siren-like woman suddenly raised her arms.
She has a wand,
Jen said. Sure enough, the woman was clutching a wand in one hand.
And so,
The woman cried.
we welcome our newest disciple upon the successful completion of his initiation.
As the others applauded, she motioned to the wizard standing next to her, and I forced myself to look away from her and focus on him. Had I seen him somewhere before?
Hey, isn't that the guy who was with the jackal?
Mariana gasped. None of us had gotten a great look at him, but it certainly looked like the same person.
I think so.
Jen said. The man looked tired, if not ill, as he stood next to the woman. He didn't seem very pleased to have everyone clapping for him. He simply nodded his head a couple of times.
He looks sick.
Mariana commented.
Like his familiar just died?
Jen suggested. A chill ran up my spine, and I swallowed nervously. For a moment, I focused on my bond with Thomas, just to make sure. To my relief, he not only felt safe, but it also seemed like the pain from the blood magic was wearing off. It killed me every time we had to split up during times like this. Not that we had experienced a time like this. But after a couple of decades working together, I was used to ignoring my instincts to stay close to him and do what needed to be done instead. I reflexively checked Shannon as well, who was worried, most likely about us. But otherwise grand. I always tried to avoid checking in on Delilah, but couldn't stop the thought of her. After so many years of trying to block her out, the sudden lack of bond was almost harder to ignore than her feelings had been. But now wasn't the time. I turned toward Jen, just in time to catch her staring vacantly in the same direction I had been. Sensing wrack, I assumed.
Now,
The Blood Witch who seemed to be in charge said loudly.
I have received some disturbing news from my Minotaur. Donna is dead. That's impossible.
A voice gasped. The first witch snapped her head toward the voice, and I felt a chill.
Excuse me?
She breathed.
My apologies, Mistress Ilaria.
The voice continued. I recognized it as the Blood Witch who spoke with Jen, and my heart sank.
Oh no.
Jen whispered.
Taylor.
I felt as if I was holding my breath. There was no question now that the woman we were watching was Ilaria.
It's just that I spoke with Donna just a few minutes ago. What?
Ilaria shrieked.
Where?
The other bloodcasters shrank back, leaving Taylor exposed and alone.
I went back to the cabanas to...
Taylor paused.
There was someone in one. It was a witch. She said she was Donna. She said she had, information for you. She told me to go on ahead to the ritual while she prepared something. Describe her.
Ilaria said. Her voice was so soft I could hardly hear her. Yet there was no mistaking the malice in it. Taylor's description was even quieter. But I had seen Donna, and knew that there was no way to mix her up with Jen.
That was not Donna.
Spat Ilaria.
It seems we have an imposter in our midst. Donna died within the labyrinth yesterday.
I thought you said the Minotaur wouldn't hurt us,
Shouted a male voice.
that it was under your control. I knew using a labyrinth to travel was a bad idea.
Ilaria whirled and snapped her hand out toward the speaker.
Skull Angral.
One of the robed bloodcasters was hurled to the ground, screaming in pain. The others backed quickly away from him, all of them bowing toward Ilaria as they did. Mariana, Jen, and I glanced at each other in alarm. Ilaria was willing to use blood magic against her own followers. It made her more unpredictable, and much more dangerous.
The beast is under my control. Never question me again.
Ilaria's tone held a calm rage that sent a shiver up my spine.
When Donna failed to arrive, I entered the labyrinth to question my minotaur and discovered that someone else had been there, and Donna was dead, killed with a blade, not by a minotaur. Now you tell me there is a witch on my island masquerading as Donna. We will find her, and she will join us, or she will die. Taylor, she deceived you. Perhaps you would like to sacrifice her and renew your power. That would be an honor, Mistress Solaria.
Taylor said. I forced back a protective growl and settled for inching closer to Jen.
Yet, we must not delay the ritual. We will deal with this witch when it is complete. It is time. Behold, the sun is about to set.
Ilaria declared. Shite! I should have been paying closer attention. It was so close I could feel my body practically itching, every hair standing on end, waiting. Jen gasped. I nodded, and we slowly began to back away. The last sliver of sun slipped below the horizon, and even as I felt the rush as my body imperceptibly changed from human to non-human, I felt something else too, a sort of heavy weariness. Could I already feel the blood magic barrier affecting me? Would it be that fast? The discomfort intensified as we crept away. Then a loud explosion rent the air, and I saw smoke through the trees.
What was that?
Mariana gasped. Eyes narrowed, I carefully hurried back. The three of us had returned to our hiding spot, and watched as Ilaria was obscured by thick, dark smoke. Had there been an explosion? She was only hidden for a moment, and the smoke began to dissipate, revealing another figure next to Ilaria. This one was a man dressed in normal clothing instead of a cloak. His arms were up, protecting his face, but he began to lower them as the smoke cleared, brows furrowed in confusion.
Where did he come from?
Jen asked. I shook my head. No idea. The man's eyes widened in alarm as he raised his hands defensively in front of him.
Air elemental?
Mariana said, noting his white hair, too. I think so, I said. All at once, one of the chains on the altar rose of its own accord, shot out, and snapped around one of his wrists. He struggled, but was quickly overpowered. We watched in horror, as one by one, the chains latched onto his wrists and ankles, and dragged him into place on the stone altar.
We have to do something,
Jen said. What? I growled, feeling maddeningly powerless. What can the three of us do against that many bloodcasters? Jen shook her head helplessly.
This is horrible.
Mariana whispered.
Really going to kill him, are they?
As he struggled, he rose several inches off of the stone, straining at the chains, confirming that he was indeed an air elemental. A wind began to whip around the bloodcasters, sending their cloaks billowing. Heedless of the wind, Ilaria raised her wand over him.
Skalven Resh.
With an abrupt jerk, she slashed her wand across one palm, then clutched her fingers around it. When she released it, her wand was glistening with dark-looking blood. Was it my imagination, or was the wand beginning to glow? She flipped the wand around in her other hand, reversing it so she held it more like a stake than a wand.
Skalven Resh. Grash Kren.
Her cry seemed to echo around us. Then she stabbed her wand down into the air elemental's chest. Mariana let out a choked gasp and clamped her hands over her mouth.
Oh my God,
Jen murmured, eyes wide with horror. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. This was mental, impossible, horrible. And I was absolutely fecking powerless to do anything but watch. Ilaria yanked her wand out and held it high as white air elemental blood dripped from it. It was glowing. The glow intensified and a strange smoke began to swirl around it.
Skalven resh, grash kren.
Ilaria chanted. In one smooth motion, she slashed the wand down and across the air elemental's throat. His cry of pain choked off. He dropped heavily to the altar, motionless, dead. Someone let out a muffled sob. I wasn't sure who it came from. Maybe all three of us. Ilaria began to laugh. It was a cold, shrill sound that made me want to retch. She raised her arms in the air and threw back her head, cackling madly. Then she began to rise. It wasn't possible. She lifted off the ground and started floating in the air above the altar, still shrieking with laughter. Wind swirled around them all, lashing their robes and lifting a spray of sand into the air. Ilaria raised one hand, and I watched in shock as a visible ball of wind began to spin and form in her palm. She hurled it toward the other bloodcasters, and they all tumbled backward to the ground.
Behold,
She cried with glee.
I now possess the power of air elementals.
She sank gently to the ground, and the wind died down.
Soon, my disciples, I will teach you the secrets of arcanism, and you will join me, and together we will rise. A new generation of arcanists, and we will hold dominion over everything.
I stared, stunned, rooted to the spot. Stories said that arcanists somehow took the abilities of people they sacrificed, but I never imagined it was like this. But there it was, a witch wielding air magic without needing a wand. As powerful as any air elemental, more powerful than most witches. No wonder they said it took 100 mages to defeat Duanos. The power of a regular witch, on top of blood magic, and the abilities of an air elemental combined in one person was terrifying. If Ilaria had sacrificed anyone else, if she had even more magic. They cheered and screamed as Ilaria sat down on the stone, ignoring the body beside her.
Now, go.
She said with a dismissive wave of one hand.
Find this witch who has come to my island and bring her to me.
We need to go, I said. Now! Jen and Mariana nodded, and the three of us turned and began to run through the trees back toward the cabanas. We hadn't gotten far when I noticed I was starting to feel unusually short of breath, and my entire body ached. I glanced at my arm as we ran. My veins were noticeably darker than they should have been. Bloody hell, I spat, forcing myself to run faster. We had to get out of the area, quickly. The cabanas had just come into sight through the trees, when a blinding stab of pain sliced through my entire body, bringing me to my knees.
T.S.,
Mariana cried.
are you okay?
Jen gasped, dropping down next to me. I nodded, struggling to catch my breath. My fingers dug into the dirt beneath me, and I looked at the blackening veins running up my arms. I couldn't tell if I was having trouble breathing because of the pain radiating through my body, or if it was yet another terrible thing blood magic could do.
Go ahead and change into a wolf.
Jen said.
You can run faster. We'll be okay. We'll catch up. What if shifting makes it worse?
Mariana asked. Dunno how much worse it can get, I said weakly. I closed my eyes and focused on my wolf form, waiting for the itching, stretching sensation as I shifted. Nothing happened. I can't shift,
We have to get out of here.
Mariana said.
T.S., come on.
Jen begged, tugging on my arm. Gritting my teeth, I staggered to my feet with a growl and did my best to keep running. Jen and Mariana each took one of my arms and encouraged me along. We made it around the cabanas, giving them a wide berth in case any bloodcasters were nearby. But it grew harder to keep going with every passing moment. I wasn't sure how close we were to safety when I stumbled, went down, and couldn't get back up. My chest felt so tight. It was like being crushed. Every time I inhaled, it seemed to take more of an effort than the last. My head was spinning, and everything was blurred. Distantly, I could hear Jen and Mariana shouting at me, but I couldn't focus on their voices well enough to understand what they were saying. I tried to stand, but couldn't even figure out how to move. Waves of pain relentlessly struck my entire body over and over, as if each heartbeat triggered another. Through the haze of pain, a sudden, crystal-clear feeling struck me, and I heaved a sigh as something crashed into me, lifting me into the air. I could hardly even tell I was off the ground. I closed my eyes and tried to force more air into my aching lungs. Seconds, or minutes, or maybe hours passed, and I hit the ground again. Hard. I lay there for a second, just trying to breathe. Amazingly, I already felt just a bit better. It was difficult. I succeeded in rolling onto my side, to where Thomas was on his hands and knees, gasping for breath. "You didn't have to get me," I managed to say. "Like hell I didn't." He coughed. I could see dark tendrils of blood magic crossing his cheeks and temples. He hadn't been across the barrier for nearly as long as I had, but I could still sense his pain. I sensed fear and determination, just before he struggled to his feet. "I have to go back," he panted. "For Jen and Mariana." "They're human. They're all right." I just barely managed to reach out and grab his pant leg, then gave it a weak tug. Logically, it was the right thing for him to do. They were in danger, especially Jen, and Thomas would easily be able to find them and guide them to safety. He'd be there and back in less time I had spent beyond the barrier. But he was my sole packmate. The compulsion to put his safety above everything else, even our other packmates, was too strong to ignore. "I'll be fast," he said, understanding. He gently twisted his leg free, then shot out of my reach before I could react. Stupid as it was, I still struggled to get up and follow before I got my instincts under control and forced myself to stay still. Well, if I couldn't go with him physically. Keeping one ear out for danger, I closed my eyes and followed Tom through our bond. He was swiftly getting farther away, but I could tell from his satisfaction that he was on their scent and on the right track. All too soon, I could feel the effects of the blood magic. Pain, fatigue, nausea. He was afraid, too. Then, relief. He had found them. A moment later, I sensed a brief flash of amusement, and bit back a weak chuckle. Judging from the complexity of the amusement, I knew it had to be Jen giving him hell for risking the blood magic. Good. Still, I didn't relax until they were back. Thomas sagged to his knees, Jen at his side, veins even darker and more prominent than before.
"Are you okay?
Jen asked.
Do you need blood?"
"I'll be fine," he said, even though I could sense he was racked with pain. His eyes met mine, and he reached out and rubbed my head, sending a primal surge of satisfaction through me. "I'll be fine," he repeated for my benefit. We both would be. But it wasn't safe here. "We have to go," I said, struggling to sit up. Thomas put a hand on my shoulder, gently holding me down. "Take a minute." "We don't have a minute," I said. "Hilaria is after Jen. She wants her dead." He just gaped at me for a moment. "What?" Tom finally demanded. "You saw Ilaria? She knows we're here?"
"She knows I'm here.
Jen said.
And it was horrible,"
Mariana added. "What happened?" asked Thomas, confusion and alarm coursing through him. "It's real," I spat. That's what happened. It's all real. I took a deep breath. His brow furrowed as his eyes met mine. Alaria is an arcanist.
Chapter 5. Charlie.
And now they're searching the island for me.
Jen finished. Well, they aren't going to find you, Thomas said vehemently. T.S., who hadn't been feeling well enough to contribute much, nodded and growled softly, before putting his head heavily back on his paws. A tense silence fell over the hotel room, as we all sat and contemplated what Jen and the others had seen. I shifted my weight with a grimace, trying to find a more comfortable spot against the doorframe of the bathroom. Please, go sit somewhere more comfortable, Danny-O said from the shower. I shot him a glare that plainly said I was not budging. Stubborn imp, he muttered. So that's all Ilaria did? Thomas asked. She killed the air elemental and then just had air elemental magic?
That's it,
T.S. said.
I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it.
Thomas shook his head. Here we thought blood magic was frightfully powerful before. How many other magics has she sacrificed? What else is she capable of? Sounds like she got a siren, snarled Danny-O. His gray eyes churned blacker for a moment, at the thought of Ilaria murdering a fellow water elemental. Which means, in theory, she can do everything a siren can, right? Thomas said. How good are they at controlling water? Not as good as Narrated. Danny-O managed not to sound too smug.
Although we can't just assume she hasn't already gotten a Nereid too.
T.S. sighed.
It's probably best we just assume she's capable of, well, anything. Everything.
What about the ones she was with? Danny-O asked. Are we dealing with a dozen arcanists?
It sounded like she was the only one,
Jen said.
She told them that soon she'd teach them how to do it.
Clock is ticking then, Thomas said grimly. First things first, though. They're looking for us. For Jen, he added with a hiss that made me shiver. We have to find a way off this island.
We can't fight Ilaria alone,
T.S. said.
But we've got to tell John, and try to get reinforcements before she leaves, or gains any more power.
While keeping her away from Jen, I added. At least she doesn't know about the rest of us, Danny-O said.
Gives us some advantage. Except we're trapped on half the island,
T.S. said.
And I don't suspect Ilaria is the type to give up when she can't find what or who she's after. I think...
Quiet, Thomas gasped suddenly. He moved toward the door and paused, listening with a frown. T.S. heaved himself to his feet with a groan and took an unsteady step to Thomas. After a moment, Thomas turned back to us. There's someone out there going door to door. He cast a worried look at Jen. He's telling people to watch out for some girl who...
Looks like me,
Jen finished with a wince. Thomas nodded. Is it a blood wizard? Danny-O asked. I can't tell. Thomas eased the door open and cautiously peered out for a second before closing it again. Pretty sure he's a non-magic, but I don't think we want to attract any attention.
Is he going into the rooms?
Jen asked in concern. No, but you need to get out of sight anyway. We don't need them to spot anyone who matches the description. Especially since they've only seen me and Mariana here.
Except they can't exactly see you right now,
T.S. said.
Not with all that shite on you.
Thomas examined his veins, still dark with blood magic, with a glare, and cursed.
So I have to open the door then?
Mariana said.
I'm the only one aside from Jen who isn't marked. And obviously they can't see me.
Jen added, wrinkling her nose.
Since they're going to be describing me as the person they're looking for.
He's getting closer, Thomas warned.
I have an idea. Excuse me?
Mariana added to me, stepping over me into the bathroom and closing the door. Why are you taking your clothes off? Daniel cried.
Just close your eyes.
Believe me, I'm not Why are you getting in the shower with me?
Mariana's retort was drowned out by the sound of the shower starting. I supposed I couldn't complain about that, assuming Danny actually stayed in the shower. I was still annoyed he had insisted on turning it off so he could hear the conversation. Blocking the drain and sitting in an inch of water was certainly not helping him recover faster. A minute later, Thomas got up, crossed the room, and cracked open the bathroom door. "Good plan," he said. "I'll let you know." He backed away and nodded to the rest of us. Everyone else, out of sight. I stood and joined them, tucked away around the corner from the door. Thomas went to the door to make sure we were all hidden, then stood, waiting. Hardly a minute passed before he called softly, "Okay, Mariana." Then he hurried around the corner with the rest of us. Thanks to the mirror above the dresser, I was able to catch a glimpse of Mariana after she came out of the bathroom. She had a towel twisted up on her head, concealing the telltale green streaks in her hair, but allowing some strategic blonde locks to hang out, and another towel wrapped around her body. She waited by the door to the room, and all too soon, someone knocked on our door. Mariana did nothing. The person knocked again, and then Mariana called,
Hang on.
I heard some exaggerating shuffling, followed by the door to the hallway opening. Judging from how loud the shower sounded, the bathroom door was open too.
Can I help you?
Mariana asked sweetly, throwing in a flirtatious-sounding giggle. "Oh, hello, miss," stammered a voice. "Sorry to bother you." "Who is it, babe?" called Thomas's irritated voice from the bathroom. The real Thomas snorted softly and rolled his eyes.
I don't know, honey.
Mariana yelled back.
Do you need something?
"Yes, sorry. There's a young woman it seems was wanted by police in Miami. They say she may have come here," the man said. I bit back a laugh at the absurd reason they had come up with to look for Jen. "She's probably about 5'1", maybe 5'2", medium build, light skin, brown hair, and shoulder length. She was last seen wearing dark jeans and a gray t-shirt."
Oh, that's awful. I'll let you know if I see her.
Mariana said with another giggle.
Thanks so much.
"Of course. Oh, there's a party on the dock this evening."
I know. I can't wait. I better get ready.
The door slammed.
I'm 5'4".
Jen muttered indignantly. "Was that too easy?" Thomas asked. "Are we good?" He joined Mariana by the door and listened, then shrugged. "He seems like he's going about his business."
What do we do now?
Mariana asked.
They obviously know Jen came in through the labyrinth.
T.S. said.
It also seems like the Minotaur did not tell Alaria there were more of us. Since Taylor also only saw Jen, and that non-magic just now didn't see anyone matching her description, I think we should be safe here. At least for a little while.
"Enough to rest a bit, and let these blood magic marks fade," added Thomas.
Wait a second.
Mariana gasped.
How did Alaria know Jen was here? Taylor told her,
Jen said.
remember? Yeah,
Mariana said.
but that only came up because she was telling us about Donna's death.
Everyone nodded.
How did she know about Donna? She asked the Minotaur.
Jen stopped, and her eyes widened.
Alaria said she went into the labyrinth. The doorway is open again.
Bloody hell.
T.S. spat.
I should have realized that. This blood magic has me all wonky. Unless Alaria can open the doorway somehow.
I don't think so.
Mariana said.
I'm pretty sure only the Minotaur can control it. I also don't think she has any way to contact him from outside the labyrinth.
Which means either there's a predetermined time when the doorway opens, or it is open again.
T.S. cried.
Maybe even right now.
We have to check.
Mariana said.
How?
Jen asked.
We can't risk them seeing anyone except for you.
She's not going alone, Danny called from the bathroom.
Not that anyone but you and me is in any shape to go in the first place.
Jen continued.
Not without more time to recover.
Time that we don't have, Thomas said grimly. I'll go. I'll be back in minutes.
That blood magic is slowing you down, and you know it.
T.S. said.
Even if it wasn't, you can't exactly run at full speed through the middle of the hotel without attracting unwanted attention. With those marks all over you, you can't just stroll through either.
I could try, I offered. I wasn't hit as badly as you two. I think it's just on my arm. It's not, Thomas said, shaking his head. I looked over at the mirror and spotted darkened veins up my neck and across my face. They weren't as noticeable as on Tom or T.S., but they were still obvious enough, especially to a bloodcaster.
But we can't wait,
T.S. growled.
If there's any chance the labyrinth doorway is opening from time to time, we can't afford to risk missing it.
Then I should go now.
Mariana insisted.
It's right on the water. I just have to make it through the hotel and down to the beach. I can pop out right by the doorway.
An awkward silence fell as we all considered it. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't sure if there was anything better.
But then what?
Jen groaned.
What happens if by the time you've come back to tell us, and we've managed to all get there, it closes again? Then we've risked it for nothing. I go in?
Mariana said, not sounding thrilled.
The Minotaur said his doorway has 7 stones, right? I just go in and hope he lets me back out in New York this time. Then I go for help.
Then what do we do?
Danny called. To my dismay, he had gotten out of the shower and was leaning against the doorframe trying, and failing, in my opinion, to look casual.
It might only take you a few minutes to get to New York through the labyrinth. But how long until you're back? Hours? Days? While we sit here, on our asses, waiting for help that might never come? Meanwhile, you could be on the altar next. We'll never even know if you make it into the labyrinth. I don't want you to go alone because I'm, admittedly, overprotective. But you also can't go alone. Someone has to know if you make it into the labyrinth. Or if you get caught.
I'll go too,
Jen said. They're looking for you, Thomas said. You're the last one who should go.
Then we're out of options,
Jen cried.
I have an idea,
T.S. announced, frowning.
It's quite terrible. But I think it'll work. And it's all we've got.
What? Thomas asked warily.
Jen and Mariana need to check out the labyrinth,
T.S. said, lifting a paw in a very human-like way to stop Tom's retort.
The bloodcasters are obviously hoping the non-magics will watch the hotel for Jen, and only Jen. They won't expect her to be with another person. So even out in the open, she's better hidden with Mariana. Taylor was the only one who saw Jen. As long as Jen is careful, simply changing her clothes and hiding her hair, like we did before with Mariana, is going to be enough that nobody will connect her to the girl they're supposed to be looking for.
Can't argue with that, Danny said. Thomas pursed his lips, but stayed silent, and nodded for T.S. to continue.
I also doubt they're looking very hard here at the resort. 1, they've got all the non-magics watching. 2, they know Jen came in through the labyrinth, and seem to think she was alone. They're not going to expect her to be here at the hotel. Chances are, they're looking for her near the altar and the cabanas.
Or the labyrinth doorway, in case she goes back, Thomas said. T.S. nodded.
I consider that. It might be a risk we have to take. Plus, they won't think that she would come from the water. They'll watch the beaches and the trails. Next, Jen has to be the one who goes into the labyrinth. The Minotaur will have killed us all without her. She might be the only one he's willing to talk to. Thanks to her bond with Rack. She'll also know for sure if she's in the labyrinth or not at any given time. And we'll know the moment she's back in New York. Meanwhile, Mariana can swim back here and let us know if the labyrinth was open. Jen's the only one they're looking for, after all. The safest place for her is off the island.
The Minotaur told Ilaria before that I was here. Maybe he'll tell her when I leave, too.
Jen added.
They'd stop looking for me and wouldn't find anyone else.
I hate to agree, Thomas groaned. But it's a solid plan. Assuming we can disguise Jen,
I'm way ahead of you.
Mariana said. She hurried into the bathroom, then came out with her knife, grabbed Danny's sweatshirt, and sliced off the sleeve most of the way up. "Oh, come on," Daniel cried. "I liked that." Mariana ignored him, removed the other sleeve, and then started chopping the entire hoodie in half. "First you flashed your squashy everything at me, and now you're destroying my favorite hoodie?" Daniel said.
There we go,
Mariana said, as she sliced off the entire hood into a wide neck and added a little V in the front. She pulled it on, dropping her towel down to her waist as she did.
What do you think?
"I hate it," Daniel said flatly. "It looks good." He was right. The former hoodie fit Mariana perfectly, exposing most of her midriff, with shortened sleeves and a wide V-neck. It was honestly impossible to tell if she had done it herself or overpaid for it at some trendy store. She bent down to retrieve the fallen bottom half of the hoodie, then put it on upside down, letting the original hem serve as a waistband. It hung loosely off her hips, forming a short skirt. I had to admit, Mariana actually looked like she was ready for a beach party on a tropical island. I would never guess that her skirt and top hadn't been sold as a coordinating piece.
Jen,
Mariana instructed.
give me your shirt and then grab my stuff and put it on. If you say so,
Jen said. She glanced around, cheeks flushing slightly, then pulled off her shirt and tossed it to Mariana, before heading into the bathroom. Mariana held the shirt out to me.
Do what you did before. Hide my hair in it. We need another one for Jen.
"Here," Danny said, pulling his off.
Are you sure?
Mariana asked, looking as stunned as I was. Daniel was self-conscious about his heavily scarred abdomen, and rarely volunteered to remove his shirt if there was another option. "I'd like to contribute to the plan somehow," he said with a shrug. "Besides, TS would have to shift back, not to mention his shirt is a tent. Char has one of those fire elemental ones that doesn't burst into flame. And Tom needs his, in case it's sunny, and he gets all glittery." "I do not glitter," Thomas cried indignantly. Everyone released a much-needed laugh amid the tension, and even Thomas looked a bit more relaxed. Jen had returned from changing just in time to catch the joke, and giggled along with us.
Hey, they fit.
Mariana said, catching sight of Jen.
Sort of, yeah.
Mariana's shirt was designed to be loose, so even though it was obviously a size too big for Jen, it still looked fine. Although I was surprised that Mariana's knee-length skirt looked the same length. Jen noticed that Mariana and I were both looking at her skirt, and raised up the hem of her borrowed shirt to reveal she had rolled the skirt's waistband several times to hike it up.
No more dark jeans and gray t-shirt.
T.S. said in satisfaction.
Now to cover the hair.
I quickly turned the t-shirts into wraps that concealed Mariana's green streaks and Jen's brown hair. There was no way to hide the fact the wraps were made from t-shirt material, but I thought it would be difficult enough to tell they were actual shirts.
You look like a hippie,
Danio chuckled. She does not, I said in defense of my own hippie phase. Mariana frowned at herself in the mirror.
You mean hipster? And I do.
She groaned.
You should go before I realize what a bad idea this is,
T.S. said ruefully. After a quick review of the plan and some tense goodbyes, Jen and Mariana left. Thomas flopped onto the bed next to T.S. with a groan that sounded part stressed, part pained. T.S. whined softly and nuzzled him, before putting his head down heavily on his paws.
I think I'm going to get back in the shower,
Danio said.
Why don't you get some sleep, Charlie?
Even if I was planning on not sitting with you, there's no way I'd fall asleep until someone comes back. I honestly couldn't tell if I would be happier if the labyrinth was open and Mariana returned alone to report Jen had entered safely, or if the two of them came back unharmed together. Danny shrugged agreeably. As he turned to go into the bathroom, I saw him try to surreptitiously wipe a drop of blood away from his nose. "Danny-o," I gasped. He winced, then waved me off. "I'm fine. It's not coming from anywhere serious. Just my nose." I fought back a flare of irritation and followed him into the bathroom. He turned on the water, then sprawled out on the floor of the shower, looking like he always did, perfectly comfortable, no matter where he chose to sit. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting down as close to the shower as I could. "It's just my nose. Really." "My arm still hurts a lot," I confessed. "And the rest of my body is sore as heck." "I mean, yeah, I could be better. I'm just uncomfortable, though. Not mortally wounded." "If you're getting cold feet about the wedding, please just tell me, instead of dying." Danny-o chuckled at my bad joke. Then, naturally, made a worse one. "I'm a water elemental. My feet are frequently cold. Besides, we haven't even set a date yet. Not that I plan on having second thoughts then, either," he added softly, flashing me a small smile. "You're kinda stuck with me." Good. I wanted to leave it at that, but as my thoughts turned a little morbid, I blurted, "I can't lose you." He swished the water off one arm, then reached out to take my hand. "I'm not going anywhere, see? I promise." "I know," I whispered, forcing a smile. You tend to find trouble." Daniel laughed and gave my hand a squeeze. "Not all the time. I found you." "I'm a fire elemental?" I protested. "I think that's the definition of trouble when a water elemental is involved." "There are worse kinds of magics for a water elemental to be involved with." "I guess I am a step up from an electric elemental," I said. "Several steps, if you ask me." I grinned at him. "I'm going to tell him you said that." "Oh, please don't. I've been zapped more than enough times." He flicked a tiny drop of water at me as he spoke. It was cold, but not nearly enough water to cause anything more than a brief tickle. Sometimes I wish I could join him in the water. Then again, I clenched my fingers tighter around his. At least I didn't have to avoid even touching his skin, like an electric elemental did. He sat in silence for a moment as I idly rubbed one finger along his. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, though, I spoke up. "Have you thought about what we talked about the other day?" "Honestly, no. I plan to," Daniel added quickly. "Everything sort of went to hell, and I haven't had a chance. But I will. Think about it, that is." "That's all I ask," I said softly. "Technically," he chuckled, "that's not all you're asking." I rolled my eyes, but didn't push the issue. I knew it was a lot to ask, after all, no matter how much I was starting to want him to agree. Daniel closed his eyes and rested his head back against the tile wall. I wanted to offer him a pillow, but knew he'd decline. Instead, I just watched him for a moment, trying to decide if the shower was helping. I could still feel the blood magic, stinging like ice water. I swear I could almost feel it moving through my veins if I paid attention, patchily pulsing along with my heartbeat. My eyes were drawn to the darkened veins crisscrossing Daniel's skin, and I shuddered. I tried to look somewhere else, and spotted the tattoo of my initials over his heart. Part of one letter was almost obscured by a thick artery, almost black as the ink itself. Someone, probably Jen, had turned on the bathroom light, so when I forced my eyes away from the blood magic remnants, they landed right on his abdomen and the scars that marred it. After 30 years, his scars were still a rare sight. Even if it was just the two of us, Daniel usually managed to keep his shirts on, unless the lights were out, counting on the darkness to render his scars invisible to my heat vision. His eyes were still closed, and I couldn't resist stealing a look at the dozens of little scars, scattered just below his ribs and peeking out from the low waistband of his pants. I had never counted them all. Not that he wanted me to. But I knew without being able to see that there were 2 on one thigh, 3 on the other, and 7 on his lower back from the shards that had gone straight through him. They sounded like the worst. But they were probably better than the rest of the shrapnel. The pieces that sliced him up from the inside for years, preventing him from healing and making things even worse as they slowly rusted. I hated knowing that the emotional scars from the ordeal would never truly heal. Not like the physical injuries had. For a moment, thought of it made me tear up. But I reminded myself that, against all odds, the internal injuries had finally healed completely. It was still recent enough that I sometimes honestly forgot. I used to think the ridiculous amount of showers he took was just a water elemental thing. But ever since the injuries healed, he had dropped abruptly to 2, if not just 1 shower a day. I never realized he was showering to relieve the chronic pain and increase his natural healing speed. An endless race to keep the countless internal lacerations scarred close as fast as they reopened and bled. Never again would I catch him when he let his guard down, stopping in the middle of whatever he was doing to catch his breath. One hand pressed against his stomach, face creased with pain. Only when he thought nobody was watching, of course. No more waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of the shower, because he rolled wrong in his sleep. No more workouts ending with a rush to the bathroom to vomit blood for a long shower. And no more stubborn Danny-O insisting he was fine when I could tell he wasn't. He stretched a little and draped an arm over his eyes. It was probably too bright, but he wasn't the only one recovering from the blood magic, and I really didn't feel like I had the energy to get up. After stretching, he adjusted his legs, and the movement drew my eyes back down toward his abdomen. Danny-O's scars were the main reason he preferred to keep his shirt on, but I knew they weren't the only reason. A bout with near-fatal dehydration had reduced him to nothing but skin and bones. Much to the surprise of everyone, even his doctors, he had made a complete recovery. Except he was still a few pounds shy of a healthy weight. If the evidence of the experience was visible in his face, it was impossible to see beneath his siren-inherited features. It was almost hidden everywhere else. But if you knew what you were looking for, it was there in the way his ribs were a little too prominent, the way his hip bones stuck out just a little too much. Oddly enough, the signs were visible in his abdominal muscles as well. At first glance, the six-pack was well defined, if you weren't aware that his injuries prevented him from exercising the muscles enough to build them. Truth was, they were visible because there simply wasn't enough flesh to hide them. Of course, anyone who caught a rare glimpse of the muscles typically didn't see beyond the much more obvious issue. There were only 5. At least, there had been 5. I allowed myself just a bit of smile. 6th muscle had been severed by shrapnel, leaving behind a strange hollow and a nasty scar. Ever since he healed, though, he had added some abdominal exercises into his routine, and to our surprise, the muscle had recently made an appearance. It was still quite a bit smaller than the rest, but the dent had slowly filled out and was just now starting to curve outward. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and brushed my fingers across it gently. Danny-O jerked back in surprise. "Hey!" "Sorry," I said quickly, still unable to stop a smile. Once, the quick motion would have hurt, but he simply sprawled back out, and his laugh was genuine instead of forced. "Don't tickle me. Trying to recover from an aneurysm here." That's not funny. My annoyance turned into concern, as I wondered if he was being serious. "Did it start bleeding again?" I asked in alarm. "Nearly. But no. We got out of there in time. Really," he added, noting my skeptical look. I heaved a sigh and stretched my aching arm. "It's weird," I said softly, "how it targeted the same places we were attacked by blood magic before. When Donna got my arm, and Fletcher hit you. Yeah. I could still see Fletcher, long-time co-worker, friend even, whirling to fire off a spell at Danny-O. the way Daniel collapsed as blood ran from his nose and ears. I shuddered. I can't believe Morgan turned on us like that. Malakas, he spat. We were both quiet for a moment. I wondered if he was thinking about just how close it had been. I tried to think of something else. And, of course, ended up wondering how Mariana and Jen were doing. How fast could Mariana swim with Jen with her? Were they at the labyrinth yet? If anything happened to either of them. At least, if nothing else, I knew Amber was safe. She'd likely be with Callie. A chuckle escaped me, and Danny arched a curious eyebrow in my direction. My sister is going to kill me for worrying her like this, I said. She'll probably blame me, and kill us both. I'm a terrible influence. I laughed darkly, knowing he was mocking my parents' opinion of him more than Callie's. My twin adored him, although she wouldn't be very happy with either of us for vanishing like this. Assuming we got out of here alive. I love you, I blurted, trying to think of anything but the perilous situation we had landed in. I love you, too, he said, giving my hand a squeeze. I'm also feeling much better, if you want to move somewhere more comfortable. Truthfully, I would have been happier to keep him in the water, but I knew I wouldn't be able to argue for long. Then again, as tough as he liked to act, I knew he wasn't stupid enough to get out of the water if he really needed it. Nevertheless, he accepted my help as he stood. He didn't bother drying off, and we headed back into the bedroom, to find Thomas pacing back and forth, while T.S. watched, ears flattened nervously against his head. T.S. whined softly at us, and Daniel gave him a few affectionate pats on the side. They'll be fine, Daniel said confidently. I know, Thomas said, pacing faster. I know. I wasn't sure if I believed either of them, but I hoped they were right.
Chapter 6. Jen. Nobody even looked twice as Mariana and I casually walked down the path toward the dock party. I didn't realize how hungry I was until we started to sneak by the buffet table. People around us were stopping to load up plates, so I decided a few extra seconds to get some food wouldn't hurt. I wasn't sure when I'd be able to eat again, and it would help us blend in. After our plates were loaded, we drifted along the outside of the crowd and down onto the beach. There were less people here, and it was dark enough that it was difficult to see faces easily. It made it harder to watch out for Taylor, but it would be harder for her to see me, too. There were a bunch of tables and stools out in the water itself. Most had people sitting around them, but a couple were empty. As luck would have it, there was a free table farther away from the rest, near a part of the dock that was roped off and empty. Mariana and I waded out to the table and set our plates down. The water wasn't as cold as I expected. In fact, it was quite nice. I wished we were here on vacation, instead of on a mission to kill an arcanist. It would have been fun to sit at the table with everyone, water gently lapping around our knees. We could easily have brought the table even closer to the dock or the shores so that Charlie could join us. It could have been so fun. Instead, Mariana and I wolfed down our food while keeping a wary eye on everyone near us. Nobody even glanced in our direction. A label on the plates said they were made out of some food production waste product that fish could eat, so we just left them on the table and slowly slipped away through the water, ducking down low. Still, nobody looked in our direction. Mariana went completely under, while I stayed crouched, just barely keeping my nose above the surface, and sort of half-paddled, half-crawled through the shallow water, trying to stay as close to shore as possible to avoid the blood magic in deeper water. Once underneath the dock, hidden in the shadows, I breathed a sigh of relief. I deliberately hadn't used my night vision spell yet, wanting to be able to gauge just what the non-magics could see. I was confident we were practically invisible, so I pulled out my wand and quickly cast it. Everything was bathed in a green-tinged light, bright enough to see easily, making it seem more like it was dusk rather than almost midnight. Mariana and I nodded to each other and headed along under the dock. The water barely went up over my knees. Thanks to a combination of the clear water and my night vision, I could see right down to the bottom and took advantage to avoid stepping on rocks and sharp shells. Soon, we were right under the party. The dock shook and thudded above us as voices and laughter echoed all around. I listened carefully as we moved along, hoping, and not hoping, to overhear something that sounded like bloodcasters, or someone talking about me and making sure nobody commented on the people sneaking beneath them. Our luck held. By the time the dock started to slope down, the people above us had thinned out and seemed to be gone. Crouching down, I slipped out into the water and turned to peek over the edge of the dock. Empty. The nearest people were a good 20 feet away, all facing the opposite direction. We were afraid to go too far out and encounter the blood magic, so we went just deep enough for Mariana to shift into her mermaid form and swim. "It's a little bumpier than with a water elemental," she warned as I wrapped my arms around her shoulders like I was getting a piggyback ride. "I'll be fine," I said. She dove forward a little and began to swim. It was quite different from the smooth way a water elemental cut through the water. She didn't use her tail as often as I would have expected, but each long glide ended with a jolt as she lashed the water with her tail, propelling us forward. We were as close to the surface as we could get without going all the way under, and I had to keep my head turned to the side so I didn't swallow water. Before we got to the labyrinth doorway, Mariana slowed. "Can you hop off for a second?" she asked. I slid down into the water. To my surprise, it was still shallow enough to stand, although a high swell would hit me right in the face. "What is it?" I whispered, casting a nervous look over the beach. To my relief, it was empty, and we were farther from the dock than I expected. Nobody would see us way out here. "There are some really big fish here, and I haven't eaten in a couple of days. I'll be quick." I nodded and moved back a bit to give her room. Better to eat now while it was safe. We didn't know what would happen once we reached the labyrinth. Mariana dropped down under the water. I watched her with a thrill of excitement as I realized that I was about to see a mermaid go fishing. I knew how they did it, but I hadn't gotten a chance to see it before. It would be a nice, brief reprieve from the stress of what we were about to do. To my delight, the water was still nice and clear. I watched as a large fish swam right under Mariana. She slowly stretched out her hands until the fish was between them. I knew it was coming, but still jumped in surprise as little bolts of electricity arced between her hands and seemingly through the fish. The water around her lit up for a brief moment, almost too bright for my night vision. I wondered if electric eels lit up too, or if it was just mermaids. A fish almost immediately began to float toward the surface. Mariana grabbed it, then turned away from me to eat it. "Okay," she said, wiping the corner of her mouth with one hand. "Sorry, let's go." "No problem." Just a couple of minutes later, she slowed again. "There it is," she breathed, staying low in the water. I slid off her back and looked toward the beach. Sure enough, there was a familiar selection of dunes that was arched and slightly recessed. But instead of the dark cave I was hoping to see, it looked like solid sand. My heart sank. "The doorway isn't there." "Maybe not," Mariana whispered. "But labyrinths are tricky, and they do want it to be hidden. There is no way to tell if the doorway's open or not unless you go right up to it. You could walk right through the sand and in." I took a deep breath and carefully studied the beach and the dunes. No movement, nothing. There was nobody there. Mariana suddenly hugged me. "Be careful." "I will," I said, hugging her back. "If something happens, run to the water as fast as you can and just dive in. I'll grab you and swim like hell. Remember to hold your breath." "Got it." I stayed as deep in the water as I could until I was forced to get out and sprinted up the beach to the dunes. It still looked like a solid wall of sand. I glanced behind me for Mariana, who was nowhere to be seen. With a deep breath, I turned and pressed my hands against the sand, praying they'd sink in and I'd be able to walk through. The dunes were solid. No! I pushed harder, then pounded against it. Sand ground against my fists and went flying, but the dunes were unchanging. It's no use. The doorway is sealed, came Taylor's voice from behind me. I whirled, wand ready. To my surprise, she had both hands raised with no wand in sight. Wait, please, she cried. I just want to talk. I hesitated. I'm like you, Taylor continued. Please, will you lower your wand? Like me? What did that mean? How do I know you won't blast me with blood magic the second I do? I asked, making sure she knew that I knew what she was. I hoped that, maybe, by specifically saying blood magic, it would imply that I wasn't worried about any other magic she could throw at me. She was between me and the water, so I needed every advantage I could get. Taylor shrugged. We don't sacrifice people here very often. I used it up. Used it up? I echoed. I thought of when Fletcher cast a blood magic spell against TS, but nothing happened. As far as I could remember, he hadn't tried again after that. All of Taylor's words sank in, and I realized what she was getting at. You have to sacrifice people more than once? I asked in horror. She took a step back, eyes wide in alarm. One hand reached back like she was ready to grab her wand. You're not a blood witch? Now I was even more confused. That's a bad thing? I cried, confused. I thought you were one of the ones who escaped. Escaped? I asked. I lowered my wand just a little. You said that you're like me. Did you escape from somewhere? I want to, Taylor said. From here. This was a mistake. They say Alaria kills any initiates who want to leave, but some have escaped the island. She thinks you're one of them who came back to stop her, or steal her secrets. But you're not even a blood witch. What are you doing here? I didn't want to tell her the truth, but we weren't going to get anywhere if we just kept going back and forth with questions. Although, I suppose I didn't have to reveal the full extent of my involvement or mention Mez. My friend went missing, I said. I was searching for him and ended up in the labyrinth. But you got through, she said suspiciously. Alaria told us the Minotaur stops everyone, except for bloodcasters. Not that I trust her word. And you killed Donna. The Minotaur let me go, if I promised to kill Alaria, I confessed. If Taylor really did want to escape, she looked surprised by that. Then her eyes narrowed at me. Then why are you trying to leave? To get help. I thought the Minotaur was going to let me out the doorway I came in, not dump me on an island with Alaria. I can't fight her alone. No, you can't, she said flatly. Nobody can. She's too powerful. I wasn't sure how to answer that. We stood in silence for a moment, and I thought of my earlier realization. So you have to sacrifice multiple people? Yes, Taylor said softly. Each sacrifice yields only a finite amount of power. Once it's used up, there must be another sacrifice to keep using blood magic. How can you get used to it? To killing people? It's worth it for the power, said Taylor. You can't understand. Blood magic is intoxicating. It's like a drug. Once you taste the power, you can never go back to just being a normal witch. The need for the power overweighs any guilt you could feel. The sacrifices blur together eventually. Yet she had been here for only 5 months. I remembered that Fletcher said he was a blood wizard before he went to Miami. And I assumed here. Were you a blood witch before you came here? Yes, but if I had known. Taylor paused and looked away. You said it was a mistake, I said softly. The moment you get to the cabanas, they take you to meet Ilaria, she said. She conducts the initiation ceremony right then and there, before you start asking questions, before you have a chance to notice that nobody else has a familiar with them. I thought, her eyes welled with tears. I thought it was like one of those stupid movies. The ones where a character has to prove their loyalty by shooting someone they love. Then the gun isn't loaded, and it was just a test. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. I thought it was a test, she sobbed. But it was real. It was real. I stood awkwardly, wondering how on earth to comfort someone who had apparently murdered her own familiar, or if I even wanted to. Taylor wiped away the tears angrily. But I don't know. It made me disillusioned. It broke the spell blood magic had over me and allowed me to see Ilaria for what she is. What is she? Evil, Taylor snarled. What? I hesitated. What exactly makes her evil? I was answered by a bitter laugh. I won't waste my time trying to convince you that not all bloodcasters are bad, Taylor said. But Ilaria is different. I was taught to respect my sacrifices, to be grateful that they died to grant me power. My sacrifices are unconscious, and the ritual is over quickly. Most don't even realize I've captured them, and none realize their fate. Ilaria? She's sadistic and cruel. Taylor shook her head, frowning. She likes her victims to be afraid, and to know what's happening. She likes to experiment, to see if different experiences for the sacrifice result in different power. Different experiences? Whereas in animal or human form, elementals who are using their power or not, when they die, different phases of the moon. More blood, less blood, victims who are already nearly dead when she finally kills them, victims who are totally unharmed. She tries it all, and she enjoys it. If I had known. Are there others like you who want to escape? Not currently, she said sadly. Well, there's Burton, but... But? Taylor shook her head. He doesn't want to escape. He's just angry because he has realized the truth about Ilaria. The truth? That she's evil? No. That she'll never share her secret. Ilaria has discovered, or I should say rediscovered, arcanism. She paused, as if it was a dramatic reveal, and I remembered that she didn't know I had seen the sacrifice. I let out a gasp, and it seemed to satisfy her. Ilaria claims to be directly descended from De Winnows, the first arcanist. She tells us that she'll teach us all, but it's always in the future. She always has an excuse or a reason for why she can't teach others arcanism yet. The truth is, she never will. She will never share her power. The disciples are her pawns, her scapegoats. That's why, in spite of her strength, she isn't looking for you personally. She won't risk putting herself in harm's way when she can have others die for her. If you aren't learning arcanism, what are you doing here? I asked. It's supposed to be the starting point. We spend 6 months here as initiates. We work in the resort. Her tone made it plain she wasn't pleased by that arrangement. We periodically are permitted to sacrifice people who stumble into the labyrinths, she continued with a sneer. Mostly, we are forced to watch Ilaria torture her sacrifices and gain even more power. I think it's supposed to scare and inspire us. It works on most of them, except for the ones who realize they'll never learn her secrets, or the ones like me. How did you end up here in the first place? Oh, bloodcasters talk. We have ways of recognizing each other, and unlike Ilaria, we typically like to share new discoveries and advancements. I've been hearing about Ilaria for a few years, and how they say she just rediscovered arcanism. Taylor shrugged. I was interested. Who wouldn't be for a chance to wield that kind of power? She shook her head. I discovered that Ilaria was taking on students. They told me to call the Mystic Key Resort and request a cabana. It's mostly staffed by non-magics, but when you request a cabana, you're transferred to one of us. I called, and all I had to do was tell them the name of one of the disciples. She chuckled. I never actually met her, but I was given her name and said that she had recommended me. Taylor had started smiling fondly at the memory, but her face fell as she shook her head. Maybe, if I had met her first, I would have realized what I was getting into. Anyway, they told me to arrange for a 6-month absence from my job as soon as possible. Then, to let them know the day I'd be arriving, go to Miami, catch the ferry to Mystic Key. As soon as I got to the cabanas, I met Ilaria. And that was that. What happens after 6 months? I asked. Assuming Ilaria doesn't get angry and kill me, which apparently she does from time to time, I'll become a full disciple and go on to serve her in other ways. She's been a bit unclear on the specifics, Taylor added, wrinkling her nose. I suspect that's just one more way she keeps us on a tight leash. It occurred to me that we had been standing around for quite some time. I glanced around nervously to make sure nobody had snuck up on us. So, what was it you wanted to talk to me about? I asked. Probably not any of this, considering I'd been asking most of the questions. You were waiting here to find me. I thought you were a blood witch, she said, still sounding slightly annoyed that I wasn't. I was going to find out how you escaped from the island the first time, and try to see if I could figure out if you were here to become an arcanist yourself, or if you were planning to kill her. In which case, Taylor shrugged, I thought I could help you. I was under the impression it has been quite some time since the last person escaped. Everyone else was convinced that you'd been hiding in the hotel, or lurking somewhere near the ritual site. But I figured, if I were you, I would want to stay near the labyrinth where I came in. I see that I was right. I nodded. Why don't you just go through the labyrinth? I asked, suddenly suspicious. She obviously knew exactly where the labyrinth doorway had been. If you really want to escape so badly, Taylor shook her head. Only Ilaria and her full disciples are able to come and go through the labyrinth as they please. Initiates are trapped here. I assume the ferry's out? She frowned in annoyance. There are always a couple of disciples on the ferry. They'd recognize me, and that would be it. She shrugged. Besides, I don't have one of the ID cards, and they won't let you board without it. There's no other way off? I asked. Maybe by water. Taylor grimly shook her head again. There's a blood magic barrier surrounding the island. If you get too far out in the water, it will kill you. Even humans? She frowned at me curiously. My fingers clenched around my wand as I realized my mistake. I mean non-magics, I said with a shrug, trying to play it off. I hang out with a lot of non-humans. Still looking somewhat suspicious, she nodded once. Everyone. A couple of non-magics have been affected over the years. We tell them there's some sort of venomous coral in the non-public areas, and that if you get sick, it's your own fault for not obeying the posted. She trailed off with a frown. I swear I heard a whisper, and turned in alarm, looking for the source. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a rush of motion. Was Taylor trying to catch me off guard? I spun back to her in alarm, ready to defend myself. But the movement I had seen wasn't Taylor rushing me. It was her, being knocked from her feet somehow. She stood slowly, drawing her wand. "Burton," she growled. I turned in horror to see a blood wizard advancing on us, wand drawn and ready.
"Taylor,"
he said with a sneer.
"I suspected your heart wasn't in it, but I never imagined you'd be helping her."
"Run," Taylor said to me. I glanced back at her, and to my horror, saw that she was wiping a trickle of blood away from under her nose. "Run," she repeated urgently. I turned and sprinted for the water, running as fast as I possibly could. I splashed in up to my waist and got ready to dive in head first, hoping Mariana was ready.
"Scoundrel!"
came an angry shout. Water began to churn wildly, forming into a swirling wall in front of me, blocking my path. I took a step back in alarm. I had a feeling that diving through it to the other side was not going to be an option, especially since he was using blood magic to do it. Burton strode calmly down into the water after me. I readied my wand, hoping that if he thought I was a blood witch, he'd hesitate. He raised his wand and held out one hand, taking another step closer to me.
"Give me your wand,"
he said. I risked glancing behind me at the towering wall of water, heart pounding. I had nowhere to go. "Hold!" Alaria's icy voice cut through the air. "Lower your wand, Burton," she commanded.
"What?
He demanded, turning in shock toward her voice.
Where?"
I turned to look too. There was nobody there. Then, with a splash, Mariana hurled herself out of the water toward him. She opened up her mouth, and for a second, it looked like she was trying to hiss at him, like a vampire. Then, a jet of black liquid shot out and hit him square in the face. Burton screamed and staggered back, frantically trying to wipe the thick, sticky ink out of his eyes. Mariana splashed back into the water and spun around in a blur, slamming Burton in the back of the legs with her tail, knocking him down into the water with her. I thought of the occasional fantasy novel I had read, where mermaids were portrayed as vicious sailor drowners instead of fun, playful creatures. For the first time, I could really see it. The water around them lit up as bolts of electricity arced over their bodies. A moment later, he was still, and Mariana heaved a sigh. Mariana slowly straightened up, and we looked at each other, eyes wide. We both knew that if we didn't pull Burton out of the water quickly, he would drown. Yet I wasn't exactly sure if that would be a good idea. Before we could make up our minds, Taylor cried, "Gull!" The water rushed around Burton, and I could feel it tugging powerfully on my legs as the waves swept away, dragging him out to sea with it. Mariana and I both looked at Taylor in horror as she lowered her wand. "He would have told Ilaria about you," she said coldly. "And it would have been the end." She looked at Mariana curiously. "Ilaria is certain you are alone. You have a huge advantage." Then she groaned in pain and sank to the ground, clutching her head. I looked around, making sure there were no other bloodcasters in sight, and then ran back up the beach to Taylor. The veins in her face and neck were dark, and I could see black blood dripping from her nose. Unlike my last encounters with blood magic, getting in water or drinking blood wouldn't help her. "I don't know any healing spells," I said. She shook her head. "Only blood magic would work. Otherwise, my natural healing won't be fast enough," she said. I started to reply, but she shushed me. "I don't have much time. Let me at least do something right." She sucked in a deep, shaky breath. "There's another doorway into the labyrinth. Go back to the cabanas, then toward the coast, and you'll find our ritual site. I know where it is. I said quickly. She nodded. The doorway is... She paused, trying to catch her breath. The doorway is near... She cried out in pain and grabbed her head. Blood, you need... Taylor collapsed. No, I gasped. I sat there for a moment, trying to think if there was anything I could do for her. But I knew there wasn't. Black blood began to drip from her nose and ears. I backed away, casting another nervous glance around us in case there were more of them out there, or worse, Hilaria herself. Jen, Mariana called. Thank you, I whispered to Taylor. I turned and rushed down the sand into the water and dove in with Mariana. We quickly reached the dock again to find the party was still in full swing. Even though it felt like we'd been gone for hours, I realized the entire exchange hadn't taken nearly that long. We crept along under the dock and made it to the far side. The table we used before was miraculously still available. Even our plates were still there. We carefully inched toward it, making sure that nobody nearby turned their heads in our direction. I didn't see Mariana shift back into a human, because as I climbed onto the stool at the table, trying to act casual, she did the same on another one and clearly had legs. Once again, we sat there for a moment, making sure nobody thought we seemed suspicious. I felt safer having made it to the resort, but I knew we wouldn't truly be safe until we were back in the room. Even then, we would still be trapped on an island, surrounded by bloodcasters who were looking for us. At least now we knew there was another doorway into the labyrinth. I assumed that if Taylor had bothered to tell me about it, then it meant Hilaria must not have sealed it yet. My heart sank as the location of the doorway suddenly clicked. It was near the ritual site, on the wrong side of the blood magic barrier. Unless we went with this same plan, and I went through alone, the others would be putting themselves in terrible danger. But what other choice would we have? Chapter 7. Jen. Something woke me. I blinked sleepily and looked around, trying to figure out what it was. Next to me, Thomas was sitting up too, looking confused. There was just enough light coming in through the curtains that I could see the traces of blood magic on his face were almost gone. On the other side of the huge bed, Danny and Charlie were waking up too, and so was Mariana. Even without the sunlight, I would have known it was morning. T.S. was in human form again, still sprawled across everyone's feet at the bottom of the bed.
What was...
He began. Then I heard it again. Someone was knocking on our door. We all looked at each other in alarm.
Excuse me,
A muffled voice called.
I need to speak with you at once.
It sounds like the same non-magic who was here last night.
Thomas said.
It is.
Danny said confidently. I guess I'll get it then, Mariana said nervously as she climbed out of bed. After getting back to the room, we had switched back to our regular clothes, and she was fully dressed, but she grabbed one of the complimentary bathrobes off a nearby hook. The man knocked again.
Hello?
Just a second, Mariana called.
Hang on.
Danny said quietly. I saw a glimpse of a knife as he rolled off the bed. He positioned himself in the bathroom near the door. Thomas stood too, and edged closer to the corner, obviously ready to help if something happened. Mariana took a deep breath and opened the door. Yes, what is it? I couldn't tell if her yawn was real or fake.
I am so sorry to wake you,
The guy said.
but it's urgent. There's a hurricane on the way.
A hurricane? Mariana repeated skeptically.
It was just a tropical depression, and nobody was worried about it.
He said.
It seems that overnight it gained a lot of strength and changed course, and is on a pace to hit us head-on this afternoon.
There was a long silence. Then he added,
It's supposed to be a Category 5 by the time it gets here.
A Category 5 hurricane is coming this afternoon? Mariana said. I wasn't sure if it was that unbelievable or not, but I trusted a mermaid would know better.
We need to evacuate.
He said quickly.
I'm afraid you won't have time to, shower.
I could hear the embarrassment in his voice, no doubt thinking of the incident last night.
The ferry is on its way, and as soon as it docks, we'll be boarding. Breakfast will be served on board. Please, pack everything quickly, and don't forget the cards you were given when you first boarded the ferry. I'm sorry. Please try to be on the dock within half an hour.
Mariana thanked him, then closed the door, and we all quickly gathered in the main part of the room.
Does anyone think it's a bit of a coincidence that the Category 5 hurricane is about to hit us?
T.S. asked.
Yeah, it seems like a stretch.
Thomas agreed. Danny had gone out onto the balcony and was standing with his arms crossed and his head tilted to one side, frowning.
Is it bad?
Charlie asked nervously.
If you're referring to the hurricane,
Danny said flatly.
there isn't one.
He slowly spun in a circle a couple of times, looking toward the sky, eyes churning with dark blues. After one more rotation, he shrugged and came back into the room.
I can't sense anything anywhere that feels like even the edge of a hurricane. Unless this thing is moving ridiculously fast and is really far away right now.
He shook his head.
I don't think there is one. It's a trick to get us all on the ferry. Laria knows Jen came in through the labyrinth. So she knows that Jen won't have the proper card to get back on the ferry. If she tries to board, they'll have her. The only other option, assuming
He tilted his head toward Danny.
she doesn't have a handy water elemental, is to try and sit here and ride out the storm. Which I imagine she doesn't expect Jen is going to want to do.
That means, I said, that most of the bloodcasters are probably going to be down there on the dock, right? They're going to assume I'll try to get on the ferry, and they'll be waiting for me. T.S. nodded.
That would be my guess. Which means that the ritual site should be easier to get to.
So we're sticking to the new plan? I asked, thinking of our discussion after Mariana and I returned last night.
Yeah,
Thomas said.
I think that's the best.
He paused.
I think it's the most likely to succeed plan.
He amended, obviously still not thrilled with me going into the labyrinth.
Right.
T.S. said. I wasn't entirely happy with the plan either, but Thomas was right that it was the best thing we had. Everyone was feeling better after some sleep. Mariana and I had ended up near the buffet line again after our trip to the doorway, so we took advantage to get some extra food for us and T.S. Now, the new plan was for T.S. to come with me and Mariana while we headed to the ritual site in search of the other doorway. If everything went well, all three of us would enter the labyrinth. Not only would it increase our chance of success, but, thanks to their bond, T.S. and Thomas would be able to sense what was going on with each other. Thomas and the others would know we had made it into the labyrinth safely, and if we got back out again, and be able to gauge when we were coming to rescue them. In turn, we'd know if everything was all right, and if they were managing to elude capture. The island being evacuated threw a bit of a wrench into things, but assuming we were able to find the labyrinth doorway, I was going to deliberately leave some things behind, so Ilaria knew I found it. With any luck, she wouldn't think to look for anyone else. I hated to leave Thomas and the others behind, but it did sound like the best plan. There was certainly no reason to risk all of the non-humans coming back across the barrier. Thomas had been hesitant to admit it, but it was clear the effects had been worse the second time he was exposed. For all we knew, he wouldn't be able to survive a third time. Even once we knew exactly where the doorway was, it was too far from where the barrier started to risk. If the labyrinth was closed again, by the time they got there and they were forced to travel all the way back,
I think we should wait until the ferry starts loading people.
T.S. said.
Most of the bloodcasters will be down at the docks waiting for Jen. Presumably, everyone who works here will be busy getting people on the ferry as soon as possible. That gives us a chance to get into the woods, so we can start looking for the doorway.
All we had to do now was wait. After about 20 minutes or so, It started to seem like waiting would be the hardest part. I was somewhat relieved when Thomas announced that he had heard the ferry. We watched as the ferry slowly arrived. People were already gathered on the dock, milling around and looking a lot less excited than they had been last night. The ferry boarded in record time. I could distantly hear the shouts of the resort staff as they tried to get everyone organized.
Looks a bit chaotic down there.
T.S. said.
Good.
Said Danny.
The longer it takes them to board the ferry,
The better it is for us.
Still no hurricane?
Charlie said. An odd shade of blue rippled through Danny's eyes, and he frowned in concentration.
No, there's absolutely nothing.
Once they started boarding the ferry, we got ready and stepped out into the hallway. We didn't see anybody. Encouraged, we hurried along through the halls and out the back door of the resort. We were exposed here, but everyone was busy down on the dock, and the way the land rose up to the hotel was just perfect for hiding us from view. Still, I was relieved when we reached the edge of the woods with no incident.
Everyone good?
Thomas asked. We all nodded and looked around. We had made it safely without being spotted. We headed for the path and walked along quickly, staying alert in case we encountered anyone. Soon, we reached the fork in the path. Thomas, Danny, and Charlie could go no further.
I guess this is it.
Thomas said grimly as he gave me a hug and followed it up with a firm kiss.
Be careful.
You be careful, I countered. He nodded.
Good luck.
He squeezed me harder, then released me. There were a few more hugs and goodbyes and a joking,
Your only hope.
from Danny. The three of us crossed the barrier. I turned for a moment. Thomas smiled sadly at me, and I smiled back. He was just a couple of feet away, and yet he couldn't come any closer. I forced myself to turn away to follow T.S. and Mariana down the path toward the cabanas. We really were their only hope. I glanced back one more time, but they were already out of sight, heading back to the hotel to lay low. Our hope was that after Ilaria realized I was gone, she'd stop looking for me, and they could stay safely at the hotel to wait for us. We were almost upon the cabanas when Mariana frowned. "Did you hear something?" she whispered.
Yes,
T.S. said, narrowing his eyes, then muttered.
sort of. Fucking human he is.
We left the path and cautiously crept through the underbrush on our hands and knees until the cabanas came into view. It was a good thing we did. There was a flurry of activity. Bloodcasters were running in and out of the cabanas, depositing boxes and things on the ground in the middle. "There's the guy from yesterday," I said, as the newest initiate rushed out of a cabana with a suitcase and a box under one arm.
What's in the boxes?
T.S. whispered. As he spoke, the box tipped slightly as the blood wizard put it down, giving us a perfect view. It was the potion's ingredients. "What are they doing?" Mariana whispered.
Bloody hell!
T.S. gasped. Mariana and I both turned in alarm. "What?"
They're packing.
T.S. breathed.
They're evacuating.
I looked back and swallowed nervously. He was right. They were packing everything. The only explanation was that they were evacuating too. "But there's no hurricane," Mariana said.
Just because Danny didn't sense it,
T.S. said grimly.
doesn't mean there isn't one.
"No way," Mariana hissed. "Hurricanes can be unpredictable, but a tropical depression turning into a Category 5 hurricane overnight? Mm-mm. And too far away for Danny to sense, even though it'll be here this afternoon? It would have to be moving impossibly fast. Even if Danny couldn't sense the storm itself, it would have to be affecting the tides by now. Unless," I said slowly, "there isn't one yet. Unless it's a magic hurricane." "You think bloodcasters can make a hurricane?" Mariana gasped.
It's mental.
T.S. said slowly.
A week ago I would have said impossible. But after what we've seen, even if blood magic alone can't do it, we don't know what types of magic Solaria has sacrificed, or even what kind of power arcanists have. Maybe she can conjure a hurricane.
As if on cue, "Hurry up," called an impatient, familiar voice that sent a shiver up my spine. I held my breath, not even daring to breathe, as Ilaria herself stepped out from one of the cabanas. She was holding, of all things, a walkie-talkie. I almost laughed at the unexpected sight of it. "Our renegade witch still has not boarded the ferry," she said in irritation, "and no one thinks they have spotted her on the dock yet. Finish up. We're leaving."
Won't the others be affected by the hurricane?
One of them asked. Ilaria scoffed at him. "There won't be a hurricane. I have something much more thorough in mind." T.S., Mariana, and I exchanged a nervous look. "When will we return, mistress?" asked a blood witch as she came down the little steps to her cabana. She switched her suitcase to her other hand and glanced behind her as if she was hoping to just leave it. "We will not." Ilaria's declaration was met by several gasps. "Now that this witch is here, we have been compromised. I cannot assume that her death will solve this problem. If she spoke of this to anyone or left any clues behind her, no. No, I will not risk leaving any evidence behind. The island has served its purpose, sooner perhaps than I intended, but it is of no consequence. Come." Ilaria spun abruptly with a swish of her cloak and began to stride away, leaving a couple of suitcases on the ground behind her. I wasn't surprised when two of the bloodcasters scrambled to pick them up, in addition to their own things. The rest of them quickly followed her out of the clearing, heading in the direction of the ritual site. We waited until they were out of sight, then cautiously began to follow. "That didn't sound good," Mariana whispered.
No.
T.S. agreed.
Although I feel quite a bit better about leaving the others behind, if Ilaria is gone.
I nodded in agreement. As long as we could make it through the labyrinth, we'd be okay. Unless Solaria ordered the Minotaur to close this doorway once she was through. "We have to hurry," I gasped, as it occurred to me. Ilaria could have this doorway closed. "We have to get inside before she reaches the Minotaur."
Bloody hell.
T.S. spat.
Let's go.
We sped up, hurrying to catch up before we lost them. As we neared their ritual site, we slowed down, practically crawling through the underbrush to keep out of sight. Just before we broke through the trees, someone cried out in pain, and I heard a familiar voice chanting. I pushed aside the last few leaves and bit back a gasp of horror. One of the bloodcasters was suspended in the air, in front of Ilaria. As we and the others looked on in shock, Ilaria sliced her wand across his throat. The bloodcaster dropped to the ground, and Ilaria began reciting a new-sounding chant.
What is that?
T.S. whispered. At first, I thought it was blood, but the black stain appearing around the wizard was forming a perfect circle. It spread out until the body was engulfed, and then abruptly seemed to shatter. Black bolts spread from the circle, moving along the ground like snakes, winding away from the body, leaving blackened dirt and dead grasses in their wake. "It is done," Ilaria declared. One of the tendrils of blood magic ran through a large rock, splitting it in half with a loud crack as it passed. They looked like they were growing larger and gaining speed as they went.
What the hell?
T.S. breathed. "There's one headed right for us," Mariana gasped. We started to back away in alarm. The blood magic continued to go faster, and before we could even run, it rushed through the trees. As soon as it broke the tree line, plants were blown back like they were in an explosion. All three of us were thrown from our feet as the tendril cracked and shot by us, Leaves and broken branches tumbled around us, and I shielded my head, waiting for it to stop. Silence. I sat up slowly and looked around. The strange streak of black was gone, and in its wake, it had left the ground cracked and burned. A foul stench hung in the air.
Bloody hell.
T.S. said suddenly, lurching to his feet.
They're fucking gone.
I jumped up too and looked in alarm at the ceremony site. It was full of destroyed ground, all radiating out from the dead wizard. Even his body looked burned and blackened. The altar itself was cracked in half, but the other bloodcasters and Ilaria were nowhere to be seen. They had already entered the labyrinth, and we had missed it. Now, we had no idea where the doorway was. Chapter 8. Jen. "Which way did they go?" I gasped. "The door has to be right there," Mariana said. "They didn't have time to go anywhere else."
We've got to find it. Before it...
T.S. trailed off, then snapped his head back in the direction of the resort.
Something's wrong.
He breathed.
Very wrong.
Suddenly, finding the doorway didn't seem to be nearly as important. I spared a nervous glance back at the ritual site. The blackened ground sent a shiver up my spine. Then, I turned and rushed after T.S. and Mariana. My legs were starting to ache by the time we burst out of the woods near the resort, but I had to keep going. The moment the resort came into sight, the three of us skidded to a halt. Someone, maybe me or maybe all of us, let out a scream of horror. The entire building had been cracked in half. It was just like the rocks at the ritual site. One of the strange black things Ilaria unleashed must have cut straight through it. Part of the resort was collapsed, and smoke was rising from it. I couldn't tell if it was on fire or if it was just dust from the devastation. We rushed down toward the resort, grateful that T.S.'s bond with Thomas would lead us straight to him. The door to the hallway that we used to get into our room was full of rubble. The three of us frantically began to clear it aside. A rock on either side moved, and a face appeared. I screeched before realizing it was Thomas. "You're okay," I gasped.
Yeah.
He said, sounding relieved. "What about Danny and Charlie?" Mariana said.
We're all right.
Came Danny's voice from somewhere behind the rubble.
Just wondering what the fuck happened.
"It was Ilaria," I said, as we worked to clear the rest of the rocks. The rocks moved much faster now that there was a vampire involved. There was a groan and a creak from somewhere above us, and we redoubled our efforts. Finally, the hole was big enough for them to squeeze out. The moment they escaped, we all ran until we were safely clear of the building.
What exactly did Ilaria do?
Danny demanded, eyes churning wildly as he took in the damage to the hotel. "She killed another blood wizard," I said, dusting myself off. "Then she used his body and cast some kind of spell into the ground." I described how the black circle had seemingly burst, sending bolts of black cutting across the island, leaving destruction in their wake.
It gets worse.
T.S. said grimly.
How can it possibly get worse than this?
Groaned Danny, glancing around as if he expected Ilaria had followed us or something.
The bloodcasters are evacuating.
T.S. said.
Considering Ilaria unleashed something powerful enough to do that.
He gestured to the hotel.
I can't imagine we want to stick around if they aren't.
Okay.
Danny said agreeably.
It got worse. Did you find the doorway?
Charlie asked.
No.
T.S. spat in annoyance.
We were knocked down by Ilaria's spell. By the time we recovered, they were nowhere to be seen. They can't have gone far, though. Wherever the doorway is, it must be right at the ritual site. I'm sorry. We should have gone ahead with the plan, but once I sensed something was happening here...
Thomas shook his head.
It's okay.
He laughed ruefully.
None of our plans seem to have worked out so far.
I heaved a sigh and looked out over the water, wishing I'd spot a rescue ship or something. Instead, I caught sight of a strange gray storm cloud that looked suspiciously low over the water. "What is that?" I asked. Everyone turned to look. "That's odd," Mariana said.
It's...
Danny tilted his head at it, eyes narrowed in concentration.
It's a really tiny hurricane.
He held up a hand toward Charlie, who had started to say something.
Moving away from us.
Danny took a couple of steps toward it, still frowning.
I mean, it's sort of a hurricane. More like a lot of rain, but it's kind of windy and...
"Where's the ferry?" Mariana asked suddenly. "Shouldn't it still be within sight?" We all looked around, then back to the hurricane.
You don't think they'll capsize it?
Thomas asked in alarm.
With all those people on board?
No,
Danny said slowly.
it's not strong enough for that. Well, not yet. I bet it's got them all convinced there really is a hurricane, though.
T.S. said.
They'll get safely to Miami, thinking they've weathered the storm. Not to mention they can't see that.
Danny inclined his head toward the ruined hotel. Suddenly, there was a splintering crack. We all moved closer together in alarm, looking around for the source of the sound.
The dock!
Thomas said.
Look!
Sure enough, the long part of the dock where the ferry anchored had collapsed. We watched as a couple of the supports simply fell over, sending the boards they held crashing into the water.
Daniel, what's causing that?
Thomas demanded.
Nothing.
Danny said. Dark waves crashed across his eyes as he frowned down at the dock.
The water is fine. It isn't doing anything that should take out the dock.
An even louder crash rent the air as part of the hotel collapsed. We watched as a large section tumbled down in a cloud of dust with a deafening roar.
I'm starting to think we shouldn't stick around,
said T.S.
Yeah,
Thomas agreed.
but where do we go?
Where's the beach? Mariana suddenly cried.
That beach?
T.S. asked, pointing to the large beach. No, the one on the other side of the dock. Jen and I went down into it last night. She was right. The smaller beach on the far side of the dock was gone. The gentle waves were lapping right at the coarse seagrass on the dunes.
It's probably just high tide.
Danny stopped suddenly.
Holy shit.
What?
Several voices asked at the same time. Frowning in concentration, Danny knelt down and put a hand to the ground.
The tide is going out. But
Thomas prompted. Danny's eyebrows furrowed, and gray began to churn into blue in his eyes.
the water is really high.
Define high?
Charlie asked nervously.
Higher than the high tide should be, and a hell of a lot higher than it should be with the tide going out.
Whoa. That whole dune just...
Thomas said, suddenly pointing. Farther down the beach, a large section of dunes had collapsed into the water. Dust from the sand was still rising, and I could see sand sliding down the remaining dune. There was no beach there either. Another part of the dunes just sank away as we watched, collapsing into the water and vanishing. A violent splashing came from behind us, and we turned as the hillside in front of the resort rolled and tumbled into the water. The entire resort, what was still standing at least, pitched sideways toward the ocean. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate as several cracks split up the beach and the hill, passing the destroyed hotel and us. Another huge part of the dunes collapsed. Then the last visible part of the dock sank beneath the surface and out of sight.
What's happening?
Charlie asked, voice shaking.
Please tell me the whole island isn't going to... collapse.
I vote we don't wait around to find out,
Danny said.
We have to find the labyrinth doorway and get the hell out of here.
But you're not human, Mariana gasped. You guys can't cross it,
We might not have a choice.
Thomas said,
Oh, you aren't going to like this.
said Danny slowly.
There's water under us.
We're on an island.
Charlie shot back, eyes flaring.
Islands aren't supposed to float.
Are you saying we're floating?
Charlie shrieked. Danny glared down at his feet.
I'm saying water is where it shouldn't be. There's quite a lot of it. It's
He tilted his head like he was listening.
rushing. Moving. Fast. Like it's filling an empty space.
Under us?
Charlie said. Danny's answer was drowned out as the entire hotel went crashing down into the ocean, leaving little doubt as to what the answer had been.
Run.
T.S. suggested. We turned and ran, heading for the woods away from the shore as fast as we could. The frantic race seemed insane once we were inside the trees. It felt like a beautiful tropical day. The sun was still shining through the leaves, and everything was quiet and peaceful. Except the island was quite possibly collapsing all around us. Soon, we were back at the part where the path split off, standing on the safe side of the barrier, trying to catch our breaths.
They wouldn't actually destroy the island, would they?
Asked Thomas.
They've got this whole thing all set up.
Ilaria said it was time, didn't she?
T.S. said grimly, glancing at me and Mariana. She said the island was compromised, I said. That she couldn't leave any evidence and it served its purpose, Mariana finished darkly. Sounds like she won't care if it collapses into the ocean. She said they aren't coming back.
She said, if the non-magics all believe there was a hurricane, they'll probably accept the island was destroyed,
T.S. said. We all turned and faced the path to the cabanas, the place only 3 of us could safely take.
We have to find the doorway.
T.S. said.
You two and me.
He nodded to me and Mariana. Then he turned to Thomas and the others.
As soon as we find it, I'll signal you. Come right to me, as quickly as you can.
He paused and shook his head.
There's nothing else we can do.
What if the doorway is closed?
Charlie asked with a visible shiver as he cast a look over his shoulder.
Then we'll figure out something else.
Danny said firmly. He pulled Charlie against him protectively.
One way or another, we're all getting off this stupid island. Alive.
Go,
Said Thomas.
we can't waste any time.
Once again, I found myself running toward the ritual site. This time, I felt even more desperate. Hopeless. My head was swirling with the what-ifs. What if the doorway was closed? What if it wasn't? Could the others even make it there? What if... We didn't slow down until we reached the ritual site. Even then, we only did so out of caution. As soon as it was clear the bloodcasters really were gone, we hurried out to the open area. There was a loud splash, and Mariana hurried to the far side of the site. "Oh no, the water's right down there," she cried. "The cliff is already starting to fall." The end of her sentence was punctuated by the sound of crackling rocks, quickly followed by another splash.
We've got to find it.
T.S. said.
Look everywhere.
The 3 of us combed the ritual site, but none of us could see anything that looked like the entrance to the labyrinth. Maybe it really was closed. For a moment, the 3 of us stood together helplessly. Then we split back up to check it all over again, growing more frantic with every wasted minute. Periodic cracks and splashes made us feel even more desperate. The ground was noticeably shaking now. The slight vibration had turned into a rumble that threw me off balance if I wasn't careful. "The air elemental!" Mariana cried suddenly. "What?" I called back, half expecting to see his body or something. "What about him? Where did he come from?" "I didn't see because of the smoke," I answered. "It was like he came out of thin air." I realized with a thrill what she was getting at. Or
a labyrinth.
T.S. finished out loud.
Come on.
We rushed down to the altar and started inspecting it. Nothing. I circled it several times while T.S. and Mariana did the same. Just as I was starting to think it was another dead end, I spotted something odd about a rock at the base of the altar. The rock had been split by Alaria's spell, but the shadow it cast seemed strange. I knelt down and pulled away one of the broken pieces. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was a crack that looked bigger than it should have been. Mar, I whispered. A flame burst to life on the end of my wand, and I poked it down into the crack. I could just barely see what looked like stairs. Stairs! I choked.
What?
T.S. called. Stairs, here! They were by my side in an instant. How do we get to them? Mariana asked. We looked frantically for something that would make it open. This had to be the way into the labyrinth.
If I could just fecking shift.
T.S. muttered, scrabbling at the dirt around the crack with his hands in a dog-like way that would have been funny under better circumstances.
Oh!
He yelped. He pulled back his hands and examined a nail that had bent back. I tugged desperately at a rock as hard as I could. It wouldn't even budge. I tried another angle, then slipped and sliced my palm open on the jagged edge. I cursed and examined the wound. It wasn't too bad, thankfully. Blood began to drip from my palm. A couple of drops hit the ground and sizzled. Forget my palm. That wasn't right. Blood. That's what Taylor was trying to say. Hardly daring to breathe, I turned my hand and clenched my fist, wincing as my fingers dug into my wound. Several drops fell and splattered into the rocks below. They sizzled too, and then, with a lurch, the ground began to slide, opening up into a hole just large enough for a person to drop down through, onto the stairs. This has to be it, Mariana said.
Look, there.
T.S. said eagerly. A smashed bottle and a bunch of potion ingredients were on the stairs below us. The bloodcasters must have come this way. But is the labyrinth open? I asked. What if the stairs just lead to a dead end?
One way to find out,
T.S. said. Wait, I should... Mariana paused, halfway into the hole. Thomas needs you here, so he can sense where to go, she said. There's no time to argue. With that, she dropped in and rushed down the steps and out of sight. There's a tunnel here at the bottom, she called. I can't tell if... T.S. and I exchanged a look of alarm. Mariana? I called.
Mariana!
T.S. yelled. There was no answer.
Bloody hell.
She's in, I breathed. The labyrinth is open. Call Thomas.
Done,
said T.S. almost instantly. We stood around the hole, waiting, heart pounding. If nothing else, at least Mariana had gotten inside. I just had to hope she could get out safely without running into Ilaria. Even if the worst happened, even if only Mariana escaped, someone had to tell John what happened here. He had to know about Ilaria. Several crashes and a rush of movement caught my attention. I could see the tops of nearby trees falling. Was the water that close? The entire ground suddenly lurched sideways and we staggered. Where are they? I asked.
taking too long, that's where. Come on.
T.S. sprinted for the trees, leaving me to follow. It wasn't long before we reached the others, and I was instantly glad we had. They would never have gotten to the site in time. As much as I longed to help Thomas, I knew T.S. would struggle to fight the compulsion to help his soul pack mate, so I forced myself to go to Charlie first. He practically collapsed into my arms, breathing heavily. He was already covered in the horrible network of blackened veins, looking darker and more swollen than ever. Even the capillaries in his eyes were black. I immediately positioned myself under one of his arms and started back toward the ritual site, ignoring how his skin was burning me. I had to trust that T.S. would be able to help Thomas and Danny, Charlie stumbled along next to me, audibly gasping for breath as I tugged him along. Running was out of the question, but each passing, wasted second was critical. By the time we reached the site, I was almost dragging him. The cliffs were noticeably smaller, and a huge chunk fell down right before our eyes. The water sounded higher. More trees fell, followed by another section of cliff, and then I saw the ocean. None of us had any time. We were nearly to the altar when the ground pitched again.
Tom!
T.S. cried suddenly. I turned to see Thomas on his hands and knees. He started coughing, then vomited black blood.
Thomas, come on. You've got to get up.
T.S. said.
We have to get out of here.
Thomas coughed a couple more times, but gave no indication he had even heard T.S. Danny leaned heavily on the altar, where T.S. had left him, and I forced myself to go to his side, leaving Charlie swaying behind me. T.S., get him out of here, I said. T.S. looked at me and nodded. He may have been human, but he was still twice as big as Thomas, and it was hardly any trouble for T.S. to lift him completely off the ground. Danny was a lot harder to assist than Charlie, considering he was a foot taller than me. But I managed. Like Charlie and Thomas, his veins were all swollen and black. I glanced up at him. As we went, and to my horror, black blood was trickling out of his ear. I tucked my other shoulder under Charlie's arm and gritted my teeth as I tried to help both of them to the doorway. T.S. dropped down into the hole with Thomas, and we were right behind them. After only a couple of steps, Danny stumbled, and all three of us almost went down. I barely managed to catch my balance, but he pulled away from me and leaned against the wall weakly. Danny, come on, I pleaded.
I can't.
He started. I was about to repeat myself when he finished.
I can't see.
I assumed the blood magic was interfering with his abilities, just like T.S. hadn't been able to shift. It was dark down here. I quickly cast my night vision spell on myself, then turned my attention to him. Mar? Better? He panted.
It's not that.
He pressed a hand to the side of his head with a grimace. Come on, then, I cried, practically dragging him down the stairs with me, silently cursing blood magic. Thankfully, there were only a few stairs. We hurried down, rounded a corner, and tumbled out into a room. T.S. stopped so abruptly I nearly slammed into him, then gasped as I saw Mariana. Had we made it? Chapter 9. Jen. We were in a small, circular room with 7 arched doorways, each with a stone staircase curling up beyond them.
Jen,
T.S. cried.
can you sense rock?
I reached out. No. No,
We're in.
he breathed.
We made it.
Is everyone okay?
Charlie asked, sagging against me. The arm Donna had injured hung limp at his side, and he looked paler than I had ever seen him. But if we were in the labyrinth, then we had to be away from the influence of the barrier.
Mostly.
Thomas said hoarsely.
I will be.
Me too.
Danny groaned, although it felt like I was the only thing keeping him on his feet. 7 stones, right? I asked.
Right.
T.S. confirmed. Mariana rushed over to me. Danny was leaning so heavily against me, I wasn't sure I could transfer him. So I angled myself so Mariana could reach Charlie and gratefully let her take him. We quickly found the doorway with 7 stones and hurried through. The stairs curled around, and I prayed with each twist that we'd find ourselves in the Minotaur's cave. I don't think we would all survive a trip through any other layer of the labyrinth. I nearly sobbed in relief as the stairs led out to a large hallway. We made our way down, T.S. still holding Thomas, me practically dragging Danny, and Mariana supporting Charlie. The hall opened into the Minotaur's huge cave. It was where I wanted to be, but the memory of what happened here made my stomach twist nervously. The ground suddenly jolted as I heard the sound of a huge hoof. I swallowed nervously as another hoof thudded down. The air echoed with the thunderous clop of the Minotaur's steps, and, at last, he appeared.
You have returned,
He said as he towered over us. A dry, dark chuckle emanated from him.
Worshipful, where I see you.
Can you help them? I blurted, even though I knew he couldn't heal blood magic.
Do only for a moment.
I shrieked in surprise as the ground beneath me gave way. Danny and I splashed down into a pit full of cold water. I stood instinctively. The water came up to my shoulders. I knew Danny couldn't drown, but it was surprisingly hard to not try and dive down to help him. Mariana jumped back just as a fire burst into life around Charlie. The Minotaur swung his massive head toward Thomas and T.S. The memory of his horn goring Thomas ran through my head. I felt sick. Yet now, here he was helping us.
Blood I cannot conjure a manner that will aid you.
The Minotaur said.
Feed.
T.S. said in response. He knelt down and offered his neck to Thomas.
Teth.
Just fucking do it.
Thomas sighed, but weakly began to lick T.S.'s neck.
You.
The Minotaur stomped suddenly forward, sticking his face terrifyingly close to mine.
Alaria lives.
My heart skipped a beat. Yes, but now we've seen, we're going to find her, I stammered. He laughed, and a cloud of his rancid breath hit me, nearly gagging me.
She was here. She is furious. You ruined her island.
He laughed again.
I like when she is pained. She does not realize, but she too sustains me. Her emotions are strong, delicious.
His huge head tilted, and I got the impression he was studying me.
That power is why I resist. For now.
Resist?
Her orders.
She said she controls you? I asked, filled with the odd feeling I needed to delay something, but I couldn't put my finger on what.
Yes.
The Minotaur bellowed. Thomas hadn't had nearly enough, but quickly began to close the puncture on T.S.'s neck. T.S. let him, obviously as unnerved as I was.
She has discovered the way to bind a minotaur. Only with a death can I be free.
We'll kill her, I promised.
Go.
The Minotaur said flatly. The cavern shook as a large hole opened, leading to the exit.
Go now.
He repeated. The fire around Charlie faded, and he climbed weakly to his feet. looking at the water in concern.
Danny needs more time.
He protested.
So does Thomas.
T.S. said.
And you.
He added, nodding to Charlie.
No!
Raged the Minotaur, thunderous voice rattling the pebbles on the ground around us.
Alaria has commanded me to kill all who enter from the island.
What? I cried in horror.
I resist for now, but I weaken. Go before I kill you all.
How do we get home? I begged. Which doorway? We can't kill Alaria without help. Please.
5 stones. Now go.
T.S. heaved Thomas to his feet as Mariana quickly pulled Charlie's good arm over her shoulder.
Jen.
Thomas said weakly. I'm coming. Go, I cried.
Now.
Screamed the Minotaur.
Run.
Several stalactites broke off and hit the ground, shattering in a spray of broken rock.
Run.
He took several huge, ground-covering steps toward the others as they struggled away, then swung his club. It looked like he was still fighting the compulsion, but the deliberate miss was still too close for comfort.
What's happening?
I shrieked as Danny popped up out of the water next to me.
Are we?
He stopped and looked around the cavern. He was squinting, but obviously he could see better. Yes, and Alaria's making the Minotaur kill us, I whispered. Let's go. I heaved myself out of the water and turned to help Danny. I knew he was still in bad shape, considering he not only accepted, but seemed to really need my help. The Minotaur roared in anger as the others made it into the hallway to the doorways. He spun and bellowed again. I pulled Danny behind a large boulder and tried to find out how to get around the Minotaur. Thankfully, Danny was moving under his own power again. We both crept along behind the rocks. It was the long way around, but we were nearly there.
Jen.
Danny hissed suddenly. What?
Where the hell is the Minotaur?
I turned and looked around in alarm. I was so focused on getting out, I had completely lost track of the huge monster. Suddenly, a rock near us exploded as the club swung through.
I will kill you.
The Minotaur roared. Forget stealth. Danny and I sprinted to the hall. The ground shook and the cavern echoed with the Minotaur's thundering screams of rage. His hooves slammed into the ground behind us, growing closer and closer with each pounding step. We reached the door and raced through, bellows echoing behind us as we miraculously reached the room with 7 exits.
Skata.
Danny groaned, collapsing on the ground. We still have to get out of here, I said, tugging on his arm. He staggered to his feet, wiping away blood from his nose.
God, my head is killing me. Literally.
I gasped in alarm. Yeah, he had a morbid sense of humor, but something about the laugh seemed off.
Sorry.
He groaned and rubbed his temples.
I'm starting to feel kind of out of it.
Then let's get you out of here and get you back in some water.
Which door?
The one with 5 stones, I said, looking around for the first time. I expected it to look just like it did before, but it didn't. One of the doorways was blocked by a pile of sand. I looked around and didn't see the doorway with 3 stones on the first step anywhere. That must have been the one that led to the island, the one Ilaria had ordered him to seal. I spotted the staircase with a bottom step made out of 5 stones and dragged Danny to it. Come on, We went up as fast as he could manage. Then the stairs stopped and opened into a long stone corridor. Despite my night vision, it still looked dark.
What the?
Danny breathed. This isn't right, I gasped. It's supposed to be the park. An eerie feeling washed over me. Something was wrong. I realized that I could feel Rack. We were out of the labyrinth, but he was far away, very far away. I turned to go back, and my heart skipped a beat. There was a solid stone wall behind us. Danny, the doorway is gone. We both looked down the corridor, then stiffened as the sound of footsteps began to echo. A shadow appeared on the far wall. Someone was coming. If it was a bloodcaster, we were dead. He may have been fighting just to stay on his feet, but Danny drew a knife and stepped protectively in front of me. As the footsteps grew louder, he pushed me toward the wall. I drew my wand, ready to fight, and put a foot farther behind me to brace myself. I expected to feel the wall, but instead felt a strange, heavy sensation. I turned to look. My foot was in the wall. I leaned back, and my leg sank in too. Danny, the wall! He turned to look, and his eyes widened. We looked at each other for a moment. Then, just before the approaching figure would see us, we grabbed each other and flung ourselves into the wall. We nearly stumbled down the stairs, but we were back in the labyrinth. Just to be sure, I tried to sense Rack. Nothing. We rounded a few corners, and we're back in the room with 7 doorways. The Minotaur said 5 stones, I said, confused. I knelt down by the first step to take a closer look, while Danny slumped against the wall with a groan. Embarrassment coursed through me. The sand from the blocked doorway had drifted onto the step. This had 6 stones, not 5. My carelessness almost got us killed. Suddenly, the room began to shake. Danny forced himself up and moved in front of me again. Danny, you're hurt. I started to protest.
Trust me on this one,
He said.
You want me first.
A rush of water suddenly came gushing down one of the staircases, followed by crashing rocks and sand. I turned and covered my face as the water slammed into us, throwing me against the wall. Danny managed to slow it enough that it didn't completely overpower us. Luckily, the deluge only lasted for a few seconds. Soon, the entire entrance was blocked, leaving us standing waist-deep in slowly receding water. The island, I murmured. The ritual site must have collapsed too. Danny reached down and pulled up a handful of water to taste.
Yep,
He said.
this is Caribbean. Thankfully without blood magic. Give me a second.
He sat down, going completely under for a minute before standing back up.
Ah, that's a bit better already. Now what?
5 stones, I said. You can see underwater, right? I was more concerned about his earlier bout with blindness, but totally butchered the wording. He looked at me like I was insane.
No, the inner lid is just for show.
Inner lid?
This one?
Danny pointed to his eye. His eyelids twitched, like he was trying not to blink, but something seemed to drop down over his eyes, like a contact lens for a moment.
Which of us has the head injury?
You have 2 sets of eyelids?
Yes.
He chuckled.
It's not the only thing I have 2 of.
He waited a beat and then added,
Please be sure to tell Tom I said that. I get so few chances to make that joke.
Feeling better? I teased.
Actually, yes.
Danny walked over to one of the staircases and dropped down. He was up again in a moment.
We have a problem.
What?
Some of the rocks cracked it. It's impossible to tell how many stones it had before.
I heaved a sigh. I hoped at least the others made it out. I waited while Danny checked the others.
Okay,
He said.
It's one of these two.
After a moment of debate, we chose the one on the right and headed up. We rounded just one corner and found a wall of collapsed rocks.
3 doorways came down.
Danny said in surprise. Where was the third? I asked. Do you think there were 3 on the island?
Dunno.
He said.
This one is drier than the other 2. No sand either.
Guess we try the other doorway, I said. Let's hope it's the right one. We went back down, then into the other one and ascended the seemingly endless spiral staircase.
Jen!
Thomas caught me in a hug as Charlie crashed into Danny. A surge of elation from my bond hit me as Rack rejoiced. He was so close I couldn't believe it. We were back. Chapter 10. Jen. Even after a week, the novelty of Rack curled up in my lap hadn't worn off. I pet him absently behind the ears as he purred like a motorboat, radiating contentment that I was back safely. I leaned back in my seat as Thomas, T.S., and I drove to Danny and Charlie's house. We took several days to recover and just sort of recharge. All but a few traces of the blood magic had faded. Danny still had a few darker lines scattered around his face, and the veins in Charlie's hand were too dark as well. It was harder to see on Thomas, but I was sure his veins were all still more visible than they should have been. The day after we first vanished, John was able to launch his massive investigation and turned up nothing. We decided the Minotaur must have closed the doorway once we stumbled inside, so there would have been nothing for John to find. Now that we knew the reason magics were vanishing, he decided not to try and investigate again. Not just yet. We still couldn't trust anyone. John was shocked and appalled by our description of Alaria's abilities, but, like us, was at a loss for where to go from here. There was no question. We had to find her and stop her. Somehow. The first step was to figure out where she had gone. Then we could work on a plan to get her. I just hoped, wherever she was, we had temporarily delayed her awful sacrifices. Although I couldn't deny that I could see some of the appeal. Certainly not the part where she was killing people, but the idea of being able to swim like a water elemental or even turn into an animal, assuming that would happen if she sacrificed a shifter, was admittedly something I had fantasized about before. Sure, I spent a lot more time daydreaming about magic before I found out I was a witch, but I did sometimes envy the abilities of other types of magics. My thoughts were interrupted by our arrival at Danny and Charlie's house. Thomas and I exchanged a smile as he parked. T.S. got out, and we all headed in. Instead of stalking off to hunt like he usually did, Rack stuck close by my side. Ember was inside, arranging some familiar piles of paper on the coffee table, and I suppressed a sigh. We had put off our investigation for long enough. It was time to get back to our search for Alaria. We were hoping that by going over all of the files again, we'd be able to find something new, now that we had seen some bloodcasters and knew more about the island. I wasn't hopeful, but we were going to look for Taylor and Burton in the database, in the hopes that their files might have other clues that could give us more information. We had already tried to find Alaria with no luck. She either was using a different name or had somehow managed to be deleted from the database entirely, or never entered in the first place. It was a frustrating, albeit not unexpected, dead end. Ember had been furious we had left her at Mez to find Thomas, but grudgingly came around when we told her the horrors she had been fortunate enough to miss. After Thomas described his experience on the endless beach, she admitted she was glad she had stayed behind. She hadn't wanted to worry Callie by telling her we were missing, so while Charlie had a few annoyed calls from his sister, she hadn't had a chance to freak out. Shannon heard us arrive and joined us downstairs as we were settling on the couch. She ended up staying with Ember while we were gone. She also fielded several frantic calls from Rachel, who I was still trying to smooth things over with. Together, Ember and Shannon had worked with John to try and figure out where we had ended up. Thanks to Rack, they knew I was alive, just incredibly far away. I looked at the papers, feeling torn between wanting to hope we'd actually find something and not wanting to get my hopes up in case it was yet another dead end. Charlie joined us, and to my relief, so did Danny. It was the first time I had seen Danny out of the water since we returned. We all made some awkward small talk. It was clear nobody wanted to start yet another review of the files.
Your mail is here.
Thomas commented as we procrastinated by taking way too long to decide what we wanted to order from Aaron's. I got it, Ember said, practically leaping up. She jogged out of the room and was back in a couple of minutes with a huge stack of mail. I may have forgotten about it all week, she confessed, letting it spill out on the end table by Danny.
In fairness, you were only alone for a couple of days,
Danny said. He picked up a flyer and examined it.
It's all junk mail anyway.
Ember held up a bridal magazine. I think Yaya subscribed you to another one.
God help me.
Danny groaned.
Char, burn it.
Charlie chuckled and shook his head.
They taste bad. Besides, you know your mother will ask if you read it.
Danny rolled his eyes and reached back toward the pile. I thought he was going to get the magazine, but instead, he grabbed an envelope.
Ooh, a credit card statement. This is much more interesting.
I cast a glance at the files from the database and leaned back, grateful that I wasn't the only one who wanted to put it off. T.S. offered to place our lunch order, so we all settled on what we wanted and told him. Then he went off to make the call. Mariana arrived, and I knew we didn't have much longer to delay.
Hey,
Danny cried. I thought he'd just been pretending to read the credit card statement, but he obviously actually was.
which one of you spent $600 on clothes last month?
It wasn't me, Ember squealed instantly.
What did you buy?
Ember shrugged. Just stuff,
Why don't you have your own credit card yet?
Danny mumbled.
You've got a job. Get your own.
It has my name on it, Ember said.
Then why am I paying it off?
Danny returned to the statement, muttering and humming under his breath in mock annoyance. Charlie started hissing and clicking to Ember in Sedaic. Based on her grin, I suspected he was asking what she bought. I laughed weakly at the normal and yet so not normal day. It had been nice to forget it all for a few days. But now, it was back to work, facing an even more daunting task. Worse, we still couldn't risk trusting anyone else with what we knew. Now that we had seen how ruthless Ilaria was, there was no question. She'd come for us if she knew we had escaped the island.
Holy shit.
Danny suddenly gasped. Whatever it is, I didn't buy it, Ember said.
No, it's...
Danny half stood, staring at the credit card statement with wide, churning eyes.
It's a charge from CVLR.
What? Mariana demanded.
You're joking.
Gasped T.S. I could feel my heart pounding, and my eyes were drawn to the mass of papers on the table. One of those piles was Magic's who all had a charge from a place listed as CVLR on their credit cards. Every single one of them was missing, and some were dead. Nobody could figure out where or what CVLR was.
It was...
Danny sucked in a sharp breath.
It was the day we went into the labyrinth.
How is that possible?
Thomas said.
Where did you go?
How much was it for? Mariana asked, scrambling for the CVLR pile to compare.
$19.28.
Danny said.
And it looks like... Oh, hell. That's my card number. Where the hell did I go?
Thomas jumped to his feet.
That's the year you were born.
Thanks.
That sounds creepy in light of all this.
Danny said, gesturing to the stack of CVLR files.
That's what you said.
Thomas said, shooting him a meaningful look.
What are...
Danny trailed off.
Oh my god. What the hell was that place called? What place?
Charlie demanded.
We stopped for drinks on the way back from the farm.
Thomas said.
The total was for 1928. Cavaliers!
Danny practically shouted.
It was called Cavaliers. And it's magic owned.
Do you know where it is?
DS asked.
Yeah, I could find it again.
Danny said confidently. Thomas nodded in agreement. But we don't know if CVLR, Cavaliers, is connected to any of the bloodcasters, Mariana said.
Then, I guess we have to find out,
Danny said. Ember sat down and pulled out her laptop. Let's get started. With a sudden renewed vigor, we each grabbed a notepad and a stack of files. True, it may not have been anything to do with Ilaria, but it was a new lead in one of our frustrating cases. It was something, anyway. At least for now, we were all together again and safe. Almost as if he was reading my mind, Thomas caught my eye and flashed me a small smile. I returned it, then picked up my first file and got to work.
This has been Magic Awakened, Rise of the Arcanist. Book 6 in the More Than Magic series. Written by Elizabeth Kirke.
Narrated by Amanda Day.
And Nicholas Cain. This audiobook has been a Mercs with Mics production.